All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Open Forum Philosophy, episode 5. Hopefully, the audio setup is good now. Let's just test that in the chat. Um, Soma, you want to test your mic? See if they can hear
Hello.
you. All right.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Sweet.
We'll see if they can in just a minute. But yeah, in the meantime, I assume they can hear me. And actually, somebody did send a super chat, 75 bucks from Ruminator Cunctator. Thank you very much for the big super chat. It's awesome. I am sorry for delaying so much in helping. Well, I mean, we do what we can. I do what I can. I could be doing more, but things happen in life. On behalf of my fellow pagans, and especially pagan Platonists, I hope this helps the cause. Also, can you comment on some of the other classical composers besides Mozart, as well as some other genres such as ambient music or New Age? The data on Mozart is great, but it seems other music can be anagogic. Yeah, no, I'm definitely a believer in exploring ambient music's uh, musical therapeutic applications. I haven't studied into music therapy, but just on principle, if some classical music does better to boost cognitive performance than, say, heavy metal or really dissonant forms, syncopated forms of modern music, well, then we should be able to reverse engineer what works and what does not work. And as far as I understand, music therapy has made a lot of progress in that. So, depending on what condition the person is suffering, they can find tracks, they can design sounds that will calm the person physiologically. That's really well established that you can have predictable physiological impacts with music. So you can lower the heart rate, other like harder to measure physiological metrics, as well as brainwave state. So you can bring people into almost hypnotic states with music. I think it should be scientifically explored. It is being scientifically explored, not by me. I'm not real up on it. As far as new age music, I don't know if that has been as scientifically explored. I imagine drawing on folk traditions, as I understand New Age does, will give it better odds of having therapeutical effects. As far as other classical composers, I said that I prefer Mozart as a melodist, a composer of melody. I think he is the greatest at that. But my favorite all around classical composer is Bach. The intro music there was a Bach, not the J.S. Bach, Wilhelm Friedrich Bach, one of Bach's sons, who is underrated and really, really fun. Comes up with a lot of kind of interesting harmonic shifts that you wouldn't necessarily expect, basically taking where J.S. Bach left harmony and developing it, as opposed to his other son, uh, C.P.E. Bach, who really, okay, I'm sounding trebly, helicopter pilot audio. Well, that's not ideal. Is anyone else getting audio issues on my end? Anyone in the Jitsi, are you getting it?
No, you sound normal.
Okay, well, that's good. Well, update me in the chat if it has persisted, or this could just be a Vingle issue. Yeah, Bach had all sorts of kids. CPE Bach took it in a more kind of neoclassical, or I guess Rococo direction. And yeah, uh, WF Bach took it just in the line that I think JS Bach was more or less headed in. Probably not as like originary. Um, Wilhelm, it's like unexpected in the same way that Schubert comes up with things that are unexpected, but similar to Schubert, it can feel a little bit contrived. If you like Schubert's music, like he does use all sorts of interesting harmonic devices, but it feels like arbitrarily inserted. Whereas when Mozart uses novel harmonic devices, it is weaved into a natural progression with the harmony, with the overall tone, and it may surprise you, but it feels also at some level inevitable. Schubert just seems to kind of throw stuff in there. I still like Schubert. Um, I do like some of the big romantic composers, even some modern composers like Shostakovich. Um, for a long time, I preferred like contemporary classical and some of the quasi-tonal experimental stuff. I went through a Stockhausen phase. If you want to get into like early electronic music, Stockhausen is, well, for a time I really enjoyed it. I doubt it's all that wholesome. Um, but yeah, I mean, I like all the greats. Beethoven. I've talked about some of this before. Beethoven has a similar problem to Wagner of being just obviously psychologically bipolar, and it comes across in the music. And I don't think that's necessarily also the most wholesome. Um, but he was a genius of instrumentation and opened doors to develop the orchestra as we know it, um, and what it became, which is now what Western and like world film score writing has inherited, is this like perfect tool for capturing human emotion. Um, but yeah, those are some thoughts. I appreciate the big super chat. If anyone wants to ask a question, I encourage you send a super chat. We're trying to do this on a consistent basis and trying to build that school. So, but in the meantime, how are the rest of you guys in here? What's going on?
Yeah, I'm doing quite all right. Actually, I did have a question related to that question. So, first of all, can I get your take on Vivaldi?
I like Vivaldi. Obviously, the typical kind of criticism is that he wrote like one violin concerto 50 times. He is a little bit repetitive, but and he's typically like Italian in his approach. He's med in his approach as opposed to Bach. Bach is very introverted and he's exploring possibility space. That's what Carl Jung uh, identified as like the particular emphasis of the introvert, to explore the possibility of the psyche internally. But he's very med. Vivaldi is in being outward focused. He's like a rhetorician rather than a philosopher in musical terms. Um, Obviously self-conscious of the effect, and yet he's technically a genius, and a lot of the music is good. Like everyone likes the Four Seasons. I like it.
Yeah, some of his bassoon concertos are also top notch, in my humble opinion.
Do you play the
Don't
bassoon?
quite have the expertise of the theoretical aspect that you do, but yeah, I think there's something to just naive appreciation as well. Um, but yeah, could I just go right ahead, really, with the question I was pondering, because it is related to music.
Sure. The rest of you guys in the Jitsi, please feel free to use your camera again. Rumble just automatically brings my camera on in this presentation mode. I don't think I can customize it to use just the Jitsi screen. So you won't see me, but please go ahead and share your cameras. But yeah, go ahead and what's your topic, John?
Yeah, so I was thinking about the the music of the spheres and the idea of universal harmony. Um, and I was wondering if anyone in here knows if some thinkers related this to the mathematical notion of stable iteration. And well, it's kind of hard to just describe, but for instance, Julia sets and the Mandelbrot fractal, which is this very kind of very accessible visual representation of stability versus chaos. And as far for some reason, I just felt there was some overlap there with the whole idea of stable harmony and the notion that if you exceed these limits, you exit from stable iteration, if that makes sense at all.
I mean, I could throw out some thoughts on it. Does anyone else have a take there in the Jitsi? Why don't you expand on stable iteration and explain the concept, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think the easiest way is just take 7, square 7. You'll get 49. That's fairly simple. Square 49. It's more difficult. Square the square of 49. Well, now you're just heading out into extreme areas. But that's not always the case. Because, of course, if you square 1, well, then you're just stuck right there. And if you square something less than 1, again, I wish I had some kind of graphical method of displaying this, but this limit wherein it doesn't just expand and explode out into just chaos, really, just towards eternity, but rather remains within limit. That can be mapped in the Mandelbrot fractal. I don't know if you can bring up any kind of
You can
picture of
screen
the
share.
Mandelbrot.
You can screen share.
Oh, I can. Okay.
Mhm.
I should have prepared something on that front then. Might be a moment. I don't know, but is anything I'm saying making sense at all?
Well, sure. Yeah, harmony of the spheres. We don't know the actual Pythagorean doctrine. I do think there is something to the particular positions of the planets, actual, a literal harmony of the spheres. The way that the planets orbit, the periodicity establishes a rhythm in time, I think ontologically. So that thought I could explain. But then the other, before I get into that, the other meaning of harmony of the spheres is just the idea of the harmonia as the third level of the tetractys. So in the tetractys, we have the one monad, indefinite dyad, harmonia, and then cosmos at the fourth level. The third level, harmonia, is something like the logoi in Platonism. And so the harmonia in Pythagoreanism kind of equates to the laws of physics, more or less. And so, at kind of an easy, mundane level, the harmony of the spheres can just be interpreted as like the regularities um, in nature. Um, and I guess in terms of modern physics, the fact that everything can be described in terms of these wave functions, both in terms of Maxwellian physics and then quantum mechanics as well, and even relativity. I mean, everything can be described as like vibrating fields, essentially. That vindicates that mundane Pythagorean concept. So, which laws of physics uh, win out, which kind of have survivability? Probably those that form stable, repetitive patterns because they'll be more represented in the probability space. So if we assume, like we're trying to explain how the laws of nature come to be what they are, if that's the harmonia we're talking about, and then later I will get back to this particular planets setting time and establishing constraints. But if we want to know how the laws of physics came to be what they are, we can assume an open kind of multiverse context where any random set of physical constants, any random set of kind of physical equations subsist, and some will be non viable. And then others that have this kind of iterative property will be more represented in the probability space. So we'll tend to find ourselves not in the unstable universes that don't maintain like a persistence like ours. We'll find ourselves in a universe with the harmonia, the harmony of the spheres, the laws of physics that lead to an abiding. And of course, through time, the nature of that abiding has to be periodic and rhythmical. So I think that connects with what you're saying. And then the other, do you want to touch on that and then we can get to the other topic or the other angle?
Yeah, definitely, because that also, I think that fits very well with this mathematical theory surrounding the Julia sets and the Mandelbrot fractal, which I believe I've been able to screen share. I don't know if this is showing up properly on stream, but can you see it at least?
I can see it. I'm pretty sure they can all see it too.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is just well, okay. In the iterative equation, if you add a constant to this the squaring of the numbers, so say square one, add one, and one would be, I don't know if my cursor even has a chance of showing up on screen, but
I can, yeah, we can
one
see
would be right here, and that's the outer limit. And then you find these fields where the constants you add are within the limits of stability. And then you have these gradients, which show the degree of instability or chaos. And out here, this deep blue would just be chaos, more or less. Not quite, of course, chaos is completely unintelligible, but tending towards, at least. So this kind of ties into how, well, physics has to be very fine-tuned, and it originates from a very compact or succinct and elegant kind of logic at the base of it, which would appear to me to also tie into musical harmony, in the sense that in order for a melody to be intelligible at all, of course, you need more than just unison. And okay, yeah, octaves are perfectly harmonious, or I don't know if I'm using the correct terms here. I'm not really educated in musical theory, but yeah, harmonious as can be, but
yes.
quite boring. And then perfect fifths are the ideal kind of step, the second best, let's say, in terms of harmony, and then thirds, and so on and so forth. But if you start messing too much with that, say it's like some late Schoenberg stuff, for instance, that seems to be just chaotic and unhealthy. So yeah, I guess I really should be. Yeah.
Health keeps the organism how it is. It maintains it in the same state. And so dissonance, moving away from those stable structures, is going to lead to a lack of health. Sure.
Exactly, yeah. So this congruency, you can apply it to different areas, say some unstable mutation, cancer cell or something, tends towards chaos in the same way that, say, adding a constant that exceeds one of these stable zones would also tend toward the same. So really, yeah, I guess I'm showing up with more of a question, but just whether anyone has integrated these kinds of mathematical observations with the classical Pythagorean notions of harmony and stability. But yeah, maybe the work just hasn't been done.
Well, I would be weary of the more complex excuse the sound. Sorry about that. I would be wary of the more complex mathematics unless they draw back to those simple ratios between 3 and 2 and 4 and 3 and 2 and 1. I'm not a musician, but I am very interested in the astronomical side. And there are simple ratios which the luminaries hold to each other. For instance, the moon goes through the zodiac in 12 months. Those 12 cycles happen during one of the sun's rotations. But then the sun holds the same proportion which the moon does to the sun to Jupiter. So in 12 circles of the sun, Jupiter goes around once. So there's a ratio between of 12 to 1 between the moon and the sun, their orbits, and between the sun and Jupiter. And then as far as days and months and cycles of Saturn, there's 28, 30 days in one of the moon's orbits, and the moon orbits, and the sun orbits 28 or 30 times, that is years, in one of Saturn's longer cycles. And their ratios, so we don't find those simple ratios of the musical proportions between those, but there is a proportion between like the moon and the sun and Jupiter being 1 to 12, and there is between the days and one moon cycle and years and one Saturn cycle of 1 to 28 or 30. But then in their course, it occurs that they are at right angles to each other or at proportions in terms of the actual placement. So like, even though the moon might have a ratio of 1 to 12 with the sun, through their courses, they'll end up being at right angles or opposed or at like a triangular region. But I mean to say that there's a complexity that I mean, obviously music, the intervals that musicians use are more complex than just like those simple monochord few divisions. But there's something beautiful about being this simplification of these proportions being simple ratios. That's all.
Yeah, that's great. That ties into the other angle of the harmony of the spheres that I wanted to look at. Like, why would it be that the orbits of the various planets have these near whole number ratios, and why do the heavenly bodies provide such a good clock for us? You can imagine more erratic orbits of the distant planets that may not affect directly life on Earth, but which might not lead an intelligent civilization to come to the same ideas of a cosmic order. Why is the moon also, of course, the same size in the sky from our perspective as the sun? There's no cosmological scientific ground for that. Um, So it's a bit odd. The way that I thought about it in the past was through the anthropic principle. I've used a lot of anthropic reasoning in my own philosophy. So it's not just the case that we would find ourselves in a world in which biological life could exist. So we need to be in the Goldilocks zone. I mean, whatever other kind of basic factors have to be there. That's not it. We also have to be in a world that could harbor intelligent life. And what are the constraints on a world such that intelligent life could exist? And then not just intelligent life, but life that thinks metaphorically, that develops the mythologies that we do, that is intensely meaning seeking. Nature had to be such as to reward that kind of symbolic thought because that's what we are. So again, take it to this like fully open multiverse of all possible everything. If you are a meaning seeking, analogically thinking, intelligent creature, you're going to have to find yourself in a particular world that could cultivate that kind of mindset. It's not just biological evolution that's required to make you. So maybe we can explain part of it through the anthropic principle, but it then you kind of get into the actual idea that has our particular cosmos been benevolently crafted? And if you're into astrology, why might it possibly be that the periods of the heavenly bodies uh, are correlated with cyclical patterns of human activity? Um, well, if the goal is to, raise intelligent corporeal life up to considerations of the intelligible, if God is benevolent, then he'll bake these sorts of analogical relationships into the total. Um, for Plotinus, his one of his explanations of this is that the world is united by the world soul. It is animate together, and so as an animate being, all the parts of that being will be coordinated. So we should expect distant events to reflect one another, even if the stars are not directly causing the events on Earth, or of course vice versa. Um, but it's all one organic whole, unitedly acting. But I mean, that world soul is itself crafted intentionally, intelligently, by a higher being. And if we believe in this unbounded cosmos of all possible systems, well, there will be systems with their own respective demiurges. There will be systems with the so called younger gods presiding over and caring for the lower corporeal life. Like that will also exist. And then we have to check what kind of world do we live in and what are the odds that you live in one kind of world or another. So here you can bring in the simulation argument. And, it's interesting. In a recent book on virtual reality, the Australian philosopher, I'm not sure if I'm going to remember. He's one of like the most famous analytical philosophers. Um, Let me actually get the title of this book up. By the way, if you want to ask a question, in the past I've read off the live chat, but I'm trying to move to doing this more often because I think a show like this is sorely needed. We should be discussing philosophy and discussing differences and making progress, and intellectual content is just dead. I mean, in other circles outside of the circles I travel in, there's still good stuff. Kurt Jaimungal, his show is consistently entertaining. Michael Levin has unlimited streams of extremely big brained content. But as far as like our guys talking through things, it seems like there's been a big decline. So if you want to keep the conversation going, uh, you want to ask a question, contribute a comment, you can join the show through the link in this description or send a super chat with your question or comment. And yeah, unfortunately, I will not be able to engage with the live chat as I have in the past. We're going to keep it to the super chats and the um, the people who joined the call. But I was saying, oh yeah, I was going to look up that name. While I do that, let me just abbreviate the thought. So basically, even he in this recent book says, yes, it's more likely we're in some kind of simulation, and it's also most likely that the kind of thing that can simulate a world, or at least a mind like ours, is going to be benevolent by our standards, because intelligence and like empathy and moral consideration are all correlated. So like he's admitting like, oh yeah, we should expect to live in a world created by a benevolent designer. This is an atheist, like modern analytical philosopher, and he's like, and yet we have no obligation to worship him. So it's really wild that he would say this. But yeah, I think there's like a convergence back on old-fashioned like creationism that's very it's implicit in multiverse philosophy. So like whichever way you go, you're gonna be led back to God. So in short, like why do the spheres align in these simple whole number ratios, or very nearly so? Because it was set in motion. The universe is a kind of clock. It's a timekeeping device. It's a measuring device intended to coordinate life on Earth and put it in these rhythms and cycles to lead souls to a higher degree of intellect, through analogy, through like inciting wonder at the universe, uh, because it was created by a benevolent being. So that's that thought. I'm going to look up the guy's name. John, you raised your hand. Uh, you're muted.
Yep. So yeah.
Oh, David Chalmers, by the way, is the guy. It's not a bad book.
Right.
It's called Reality Plus, but I just found that insane. Yeah, we have a benevolent creator,
Yeah.
but you don't need to worship him.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's kind of this benevolent creator. I'm kind of a Leibnizian optimist. I think this is the best world, simply because God wills it. But these younger gods contribute to the beauty, and that kind of ties back into this thing of these imperfect harmonies allow for beautiful music to be developed. And well, yeah, Mozart is probably the prime example, really, of just being able to move in these very surprising directions, but having it still be very ordered and beautiful. So I guess my main point here is just that this idea of just, oh, the only beautiful thing is the one, and it's always more beautiful than the many. I don't quite get how that gels with the beauty seen in the presence of the younger gods, so to speak.
Well, I mean, the one causally contains the multiplicity. So it's always superior, but they, the one and the many do mutually entail. It's just that one is always going to be the superior partner, if that addresses the point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My question would be then, aren't the many necessary for the one to be intelligible at all?
I would say yes. Yeah. But ultimately, I don't know. I still kind of flirt with total monism, at the end of the day. Qualified monism is the only kind of intelligible system of philosophy I think you can have and be consistent with the fact that we're expressing our thoughts with one another, um, discursively with language, because that requires multiplicity. So, if the one is true, you can't really talk about its truth. The everlasting Tao is not the Tao which can be named. But like multiplicity is always contingent, I think. I don't think, multiplicity has the same kind of absolute existence that unity has. The the total of reality, the one total, has an inevitable unitive existence. Like conceptually, you can't escape it. Like imagine any conceivable version of reality with any conceivable metaphysics, and you can always draw a set around all of the entities in that metaphysics. And there is that oneness is absolutely inescapable. You cannot conceive around it. And yet you can kind of conceive around the multiplicity, at least down to a certain point. You can at least get to like yourself and then this undifferentiated bliss or something. Like people describe phenomenologically those experiences. And when they get deep into that kind of meditative state, samadhi, then they describe a dissolution of even the subject object dichotomy. So it seems as though oneness is attainable, but pure multiplicity is not. It's like the one does not necessitate the many in its particular form as a many. The principle of multitude is always pre-contained, causally contained in the one, but any particular multitude is not entailed by one. You can have oneness without some particular multitude, but any particular multitude will always involve necessarily the one. So there is a mutual entailing, but I don't think manifold reality ever has the same kind of absolute necessity that the one has. That's like multiplicity is bound up, numerical multiplicity is bound up in space and time. I think space involves time and time space. And space is the principle of individuation where we can count discrete things and have number as we conceive of it. And so, in order to have multitude, numerically speaking, you have to be in the world of generation because space involves time. The principle of differentiation involves flux, ironically. To have like particular things, they have to flow. um, so yeah, I think manifold reality will always have this kind of semi-real quality, but also a necessity. Like Maya is necessary, and yet no particular vision in Maya is ultimately real.
So would it be safe to say then that if the one is unintelligible on its own, it is a better unintelligibility than, say, pure substance?
Yeah, because one is super essential, one is inferior to intelligible nature. One is the absence of intelligible features, one is the superabundance. It's like to ascend to the one is sort of to, you might say, like zoom out, encompassing the principles of all differentiated reality, seeing all those principles together and seeing what joins them, seeing what joins them. And to take all of that in view is kind of necessarily to not take one particular view anymore. You have to kind of blend with the whole. Because otherwise, if you have like one privileged reference frame, you're not really zooming out in some critical way to like attain to the super intelligible experience, if it can be had, um, is to, yeah, kind of like zoom out and have all of intelligible reality there before you as a unity, but not an intelligible unity because the intellect intelligible dichotomy is no longer there, um, as a precondition of having that vision. You could, and again, vision is not the appropriate term. Whereas, pure matter, um, it, depriving qualities, eliminating qualities down to the absence of all form, we can sort of kind of imagine it with a spurious reasoning, as Plato calls it. But yeah, I think there are definitely different directions. So
Yeah, so just and I'll let someone else jump in here. And by the way, feel free to just pop in to the other people in the call as well. Don't mean to monopolize, but
Oh, also the
this
people in
kind of
the live chat. There are a few people watching on Rumble. Can somebody watching on Rumble send a chat on Rumble? Because I just want to make sure that it's all of the different chats will display. It's also on X, but I don't know how or if the live chat works on X um, with Rumble Studio. I'm kind of liking it though. It's very easy to use. I would recommend it if anyone's into streaming. And then anyone in the chat, if you want to ask a question, give your input. We'll read any amount. Again, I can't read the live chat anymore, but any amount, if you want to, super chat 50 cents, that's fine. Just some token that, you're appreciating the show and you're willing to support in some fashion. But let's keep going. Let's just ask actually for now. Soma is in here. Growing a Mustache is in here again. Aristocles, you gave your thoughts. Did either of the three of you have any topics in mind that you've been thinking about that you wanted to bring to the table?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I was going to ask this to you last week, but we kind of ended. So, what would you say is like the kind of significant differences between philosophy and mysticism? And then what would be like the role of, let's say, the philosopher versus the mystic in modernity and what's coming after?
Yeah, well, I think ultimately they have the same origin and they're aiming at the same basic thing. Uh, so I think Plato was a mystic, and I think most of the great philosophers will also be mystics. Um, Mysticism is a recognition in your attitude, in how you approach divinity, of the nature of that divinity that can be, semi-disclosed in philosophical language. The idea of basically divine simplicity or divine ineffability. Like we can recognize the limitations of discursive reason through discursive reason, and yet, philosophy as that kind of rational system building activity can't then comport itself on those terms with the ultimate reality that we can assume it does disclose. So I would argue in a perennialist vein that any genuine system of philosophy will lead back to the one or Brahman or the Tao, and it'll come up with some name for it, or Hegel's absolute. And uh, and so like philosophy as a system building process, dianoetic activity can lead us to ascend to the forms. But I guess really the mystic process begins before touching the one itself. Mysticism, I suppose, would take off when you try to, in Plato's terms, make contact with the forms. So to touch beauty itself, to make contact with the intelligibles beyond discursive reason, we are leaving a certain kind of philosophy. It can count as like philosophy sensu lato. There's a wider sense of philosophy that includes the mystic activities, and maybe ascetic contemplation and meditation is part of the philosophical life. When Socrates says in the Phaedrus, there are these three highest types of life, like the philosopher, musician, or lover. Perhaps that kind of philosophical life includes, and I assume it would, includes the like renounced life of the ascetic. Um, and because obviously Socrates advocates for physical renunciation and steering clear of intense pain and pleasure, pretty obviously in the Phaedo. So I guess it's sort of a semantic issue. Is mysticism in general part of philosophy? Well, philosophy under a certain definition includes mysticism.
Mm.
But for our purposes, like an analytical philosopher is a system builder. They deal in rational propositions, and anything beyond that, they would hand over to the mystic. And the mystic begins with the contact of the forms that can't be subsumed in discursive reason. Nous
What does this contact
is,
look like? What does this contact look
well, that would be the phenomenological ground of certainty into the nature of the forms. So we know beauty, we recognize beautiful things. This is obviously the example from the Phaedrus. First, we recognize particular beautiful things, and then we kind of ascend the scale of more general types of beauty. So we recognize like one beautiful thing, and then many beautiful things, and then the beauty of social systems, and the beauty of like nature and the laws of nature, and then the beauty of mathematical form. And like beauty is becoming more and more rarefied until we get to not the beauty instantiated in a particular thing, but that pure intuition of beauty. And you can't express that in language, because to express it would be to try to instantiate it. And what we're talking about is like the noumenal beauty. And there is some kind of phenomenological ground of that you can reach. At a more mundane level, I think that kind of contact with the forms, there's two levels. In fact, like Proclus, I forget in which essay, in one of his essays, distinguishes two levels of intuitive access to truth. One is like noetic slash dianoetic, and that's really where axioms of mathematical systems lie. And that's the lower kind of contact with the forms. That's where dianoia meets nous. And so, like the Kantian aesthetic, analyzing the preconditions of intelligibility, seeing them for what they are, uh, obviously the articulation of them that Kant goes through in discursive reason doesn't ground itself. His phenomenological access to those types of intuitions is what grounds the discursive description of them. So that's what it looks like at the lower level, a kind of transcendental aesthetic, like accessing the intuitive structure of your own phenomenology. Um, Beyond that, though, there would be
like?
something that departs from discursive reason, that would be like more getting into the great kinds rather than the lower forms that border on the mathematical. So, like the intuition of being, sameness, difference, these sorts of things. And to have that intuition would be, it's not like a phenomenological analysis anymore. It is like you've, in some sense, gone beyond the subject object duality. Um, yeah, and I guess so. Different mystics can approach Godhead in different ways, right? So there are Vaishnavists and then Shaivists, and other types of devotees, and they all converge on Brahman, but through different paths. And so when they attain, say a Vaishnavist and a Shaivist both think they're attaining some kind of samadhi or unitive knowledge of Godhead, well, they're approaching it from these different angles. And so, like, you could meditate, to take it in a Platonic context, meditate on the nature of sameness and ascend to that unitive experience, which you're dealing with a divinity there of some kind. Like, the forms are not just inert mathematical structures, the forms are divine. The forms are like, they have life, they have intellect, they're not merely intelligible, they are themselves unitive intellects. And so they're more mentally complete than you are. So you are like making contact with a greater being. Beauty, of course, in the ascent of beauty from the Phaedrus, beauty is Aphrodite. She's a goddess. And so you'll kind of be making contact with a different god. And as monotheists, we can say what you're making contact with there is a different manifestation of the one god that is ultimately the terminal point of all these possible ascents. But it can come from different angles, and so there are distinct kind of mystic experiences even at that higher level. Beyond all of that, there would be the one thing beyond experience that grounds all of it.
Yeah. I guess another question would be like, for the current system, what would be the mystics for them? Like, who are the mystics for the system we live under? Would it be like the techno, like the Silicon Valley people?
I doubt it.
Futurists?
I doubt it. I don't know that we have mystics. I mean, that's kind of the issue with our society.
Like Ray Kurzweil, you know, would it be him? Right. Daniel Dennett, right? Richard Dawkins. I mean, they're not really mystics necessarily.
No. Well, I mean, even the term mysticism has been degraded to mean like superstitious thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's a sign that we've lost appreciation for mysticism. If anything, like the most authentic mystics that I can see are like New Age spiritualists in our
Yeah.
culture. Like there are obviously Vedic monks and Buddhist monks in our culture, but they're not really of our culture. Of our culture, it's like New Age gurus or something. And most of them are charlatans, obviously.
Mm.
I think I raised my hand somehow in the how did I no, that's not mine. Okay,
yeah,
that's
like,
fine.
yeah. Yeah, just as for Daniel Dennett as a mystic, I can because
yeah, I don't know what I was thinking there. Yeah.
no, actually, because at some point he just goes, yeah, well, it just kind of happens, you know, this whole consciousness thing. It's almost a miraculous explanation. It's just, yeah, okay, we can explain to a certain point, and then from that point onwards, well, just yeah, I guess, could you be a mystic if you just say it's a mystery? I don't know. That makes sense at all.
Yeah, to say that it's a mystery is more like skepticism, I suppose. Like the mysteries in the Catholic Church, it's an acknowledgement at once that we don't know the totality of them, but also like it's an active, potent mystery that, you know, is causally effective on you, that leaves an impression on you. Um, so once again, if anyone wants to chime in from the chat, I'm not going to be reading the live chat anymore, but you can donate any amount, you know, 50 cents, a dollar, or more. But we want to get more active in like pushing back against basically the dominance of influencer rhetoricians. Like we need to have a real public discussion, and then in like academic circles, they can't consider many things that we can consider in our circles. So because we're the only people who will talk about all of the genuine issues in this world, including race, including, you know, all that other stuff. So like we're kind of in a position where we are de facto like the guardians of truth. And if we're all close-minded and staying in our own little wheelhouse, and we don't have the philosophical dialogue to get to the bottom of it, then nobody, literally no one else is going to do it, because the other people won't talk about, like, race is a real fundamental concept when you think about it. I mean, if you imagine like moral deliberation over many centuries, so more significant than one lifetime, like our moral sentiments will shape the kind of reproductive choices we make, and that will shape our evolution. And so, like, your morality, your civilizational morality over the generations will breed different racial types. So, like, to really have sovereignty over your own values, you have to have a certain freedom to willfully aspire to one type or another. And the modern world completely rejects that idea because their concept of human nature is, well, it's like inconsistent, essentially. People have this evolutionary view when it comes to the natural world, but then applied to humans, they just stop and they have totally magical thinking about it. And that's what you're going to find in any mainstream intellectual conversation. And you know, like I've talked to John Vervaeke several times. He's one of the most outspoken public intellectuals, like pushing forward philosophically. But he, you know, won't touch on certain issues around race. Not that race is the only issue that matters. Other things matter too. But what I'm trying to do is like bring the community that's willing to talk about those most forbidden truths and get them to talk about truth seriously. I think like this show is sorely needed. I don't want to monopolize this show. So I invite if you like, rather than being a critic from the sidelines and just criticizing content creators, get involved in the conversation. If you think you have something to say, get in the Jitsi call or say something in the entropy super chats. We do, I think, need this kind of discussion. I know I'm up for it. A lot of people just aren't up for it. It's a shame. Part of it is probably pride, because if you're like a rhetorician that's not philosophically well educated, you don't want to appear ignorant. So you're gonna like talk about the few things that you know really well and then avoid a deeper conversation, which is fine if you bill yourself as a limited kind of expert. But when you try to claim to know what virtue is, what the good is, what we all should be doing, and that sort of thing, then you're setting yourself up in the role tacitly as that kind of philosopher king, i.e., you're usurping the proper role of the philosopher. And if you're like dodging philosophical discussion with those who like sincerely seek wisdom, who love wisdom, without necessarily claiming to be wise themselves yet, well, then I feel like that's a pretty big sin. It's the tantamount to sedition or treason, because the authentic authority is truth. And if you don't have that commitment to truth and you're just going off of claims that you don't feel the need to defend, but you're just going to go for it, like it's treason against the truth. And I think truth is God at some level. So I think it's a serious thing. That's why, again, I really want to push that we should be having these conversations. Feel free to jump into, and we're going to be on for a while. I'm going to keep this going. We're going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep encouraging you guys. If you find it valuable, contribute something, show that it is something of value. If you don't have an entropy account set up yet, get it set up. Be active. Don't be inactive. So I'm going to keep bringing all this stuff up because I believe ethically it's defensible. But in any case, we can move on to a new topic if we have one, or Aristocles and John, either of you, if you want to go somewhere else with it.
Well, something you brought up a moment ago about philosophical monism. What was I going to say? There's a danger, I guess, in the claim can be made with different specification. If you look at like different theological positions that seem like very similar from the outside, some of these technicalities that really make all the difference. It's like how we specify whether we're talking about the all or whether we're talking about something that whether the claim is that everything else doesn't exist, or if the one is a principle of everything else that really exists. And there's a, I guess, danger about falling into the indefinite, because then Aristotle mentions this somewhere, but the argument isn't that it gets kind of glossed over. That like you lose the definite kinds. Like where we see the definite is in like distinctions between, say, continuous and discrete, or between self-moving and being the things that are only moved by something else. And if we exalt the one as the only thing that is, then we also lose the unity of distinctions or of species.
Yeah, clearly that is the danger, right? Interestingly, I believe I'm quoting him correctly for Pseudo Dionysius when he's talking about God in himself, not faced towards reality, but as he is in himself. Um, he basically perceives from his perspective pure God, because God is the greatest thing by definition, and so God deserves the greatest possible experience, and so he deserves to experience himself, not differentiated reality, not the created world. Of course, he knows it perfectly, pre-contains it. Insofar as he approaches the world, he is Father, Son, Holy Spirit, three persons. There's benevolent care and all the differentiated aspects of God. But then in himself, like to God, all things are good, and the good is one. In God from his perspective, I think the idea is that the other side of the coin is inevitable, but so it has a certain kind of necessity, but it's not the same kind of necessity and the same kind of reality. So what's real is often bound up with what's necessary. So like really real being for Plato are, forms and metaphysically necessary aspects. And then what is becoming to be is not a really real being, and yet it has being. It's not to say that the world of generation does not exist. It has a certain form of existence, just a subsidiary form. So to say that the one is, in some respect, all that truly is not to deprive those other kind of polarized aspects, differentiated aspects of reality. It's just to say that being is not univocal or univocal. It's not just one thing. There are different senses of being, different grades of being. And I think that's clear, especially from Plato's sophists, that he had that kind of view, that what is not and what is, these aren't as absolute of categories as you might think. So we can acknowledge that the one, God in himself, not in his relation to the world, is perfect, absolute, complete. Nothing is lacking, right? Surely not all the goods in the world. Like God can't be incomplete, God can't be imperfect, and so all the goods possible in the world, and good is one, and one is the ground of form. You see what I'm saying? So like to say that God has all good in himself is to say that he has all form and all structure and all reality in himself prior to engagement with the world as a separate thing. That, like, again, it's sort of like the white light contains all the colors. You polarize it and you view the different colors, but in itself, all of it is there and has that true reality. It has all the colors. And in a certain sense, it's all that white light, or like the universe is all the standing universal wave function. But when you polarize it, obviously the distinctions, differentiations are real. And if you denied the reality of the differentiations, then you would deny the total goodness of the Godhead, the total being of the one collected in itself. So it does, but that's what I'm saying. Like the absolute monism defeats the ability to articulate it philosophically, because, like, you're saying these distinctions that we're using to describe it are not absolute. But if you bear in mind that it's not that it's true or not true, there is a grade of reality from the most real, most permanent, most essential to the less real. And I think if you compare that to everyday experience, that is kind of the case. Like, what is, an illusory experience, a dream? Like, it really happened. There's a real dream there. Is it as real as your bed that you were sleeping on? Well, not quite. No, it's not as real. Or is your bed that you were sleeping on as real as the laws of physics? Well, no. I would argue certainly not, because your bed is going to disappear. Your bed, in a certain sense, is a useful fiction. There is no natural form of the bed. Beds are like artificial paradigms. They exist in our mind, but nature doesn't recognize a bed. So like in everyday reality, there are grades of existence, grades of reality that we accept. So I think in that spirit, then you can say that the one is all that truly is, in the most absolute sense of truly being, or being beyond being. But I do recognize that tension. It's like once you take the full monist leap, you kind of exit, in a certain sense, the domain of discursive philosophy. But so I recognize the concern. So several new people joined. The cross. The name is just the cross symbol. You were here first.
Yeah. So I emailed you, and I'm a student in college, and I'm studying philosophy. None of this stuff is talked about, of course. I have similar views to you, and I had questions about what is the relationship between Schopenhauer's will um, as the thing in itself and Plato's sun as the form of the good. Whenever I think about it, it kind of seems like the double slit experiment. Whenever the light goes through the two spaces, it's kind of like the epistemology of the cave in that sense. And I heard you refer to the wave function in the double slit experiment as Schopenhauer's will. So what is the relationship there?
Yeah, I think the will as the thing in itself, as the one noumenon, is the same as Plato's one. Um, and then, I mean, Schopenhauer also acknowledges the existence of the forms in the world as will and representation. Interestingly, at one point in a historical essay, he says he would side with the nominalists. And I wonder what he meant. I don't think Schopenhauer's system ultimately was totally complete. I think he thought he was going beyond Platonism, but really just did not read the later Neoplatonists until later in life. Um, and so there was just more to Platonism than Schopenhauer recognized. And yet he kind of reproduced Plato's essential schema as well. Like the will, what is the will? The will is like the teleological principle, goal oriented behavior. And the will in itself is the source of that goal oriented behavior. So it is like the goal of all things in some sense, because if it's the in itself of all reality, it is the end of all action and also the source of all action. But among the causes, of course, teleological causation is first for Neoplatonists. That's like the chief. And you can see that in the Phaedo. Socrates talks about the different epistemological methods. He outlines a hypothetico deductive scientific method and says, well, but that's second best. Ultimately, what we would like to know any one thing, is why it was made. What was the good in a thing being made? That's the highest kind of knowledge you can have of a thing, is what is its purpose? Why is it here? Why was it created? What was God thinking when he made it? That would be the greatest form of knowledge of the thing for Socrates in that dialogue. So the
So
will, yeah.
I am kind of correct me if I'm wrong if I'm confusing. So it's kind of like a final cause, like the purpose of a form in that sense. Like whenever Aquinas talks about it in his sense.
Um, yeah, I mean, you could say that the one is the final cause of the various forms. The one is the cause of all of the kind of differentiated manifestations of the one. Olympiodorus talks about the various Greek gods, which he'll equate to the Iamblichean and Proclean idea of the Henad. He'll equate those gods to the one, different aspects of the one, a similar idea to polarization metaphor that I was using before. So they exist to express the one, which is the ultimate reality. By differentiating it, by circumambulating it, by capturing it in different personas, we can know the one in new ways. Although the one pre-contained all that knowledge in a more perfect, more unitive way in itself, it overflows its own proper goodness. The will in itself doesn't seek anything, is not deranged from its good. It possesses the noumenal. So it's the thing that is really real. It's not a process, the seeker of the goal and then the goal outside of it. Just like it's not subject object, the will is beyond the subject object duality, right? That's like the primordial division for Schopenhauer, the subject versus the object, and and
Yeah, it's
yeah,
outside
yeah,
representation, which is the form of all subject object perception. Yeah.
mhm.
And last question. Uh, what is the union interpret, like, how are the forms, how do they have, I wanted to ask about the forms of the will, because Carl Jung says that the archetypes or the forms that are in the unconscious, they have an energy. That's why um, I wanted to see how the will energy itself. I know it's the source of all energy, and it can uh, differentiate it into different objectifications of it, but it just seeks like attractor states, right? So you can like tap into a form in that sense, in the union sense, through the unconscious, right?
Yeah, the forms will be like psychologically efficacious. They'll drive us in various directions. They have a power of their own. Is will energy? I feel like there are a couple kind of loose thoughts bouncing around here. It depends on what you mean by energy, and I guess um, energy can be compared with obviously matter. So there's a matter energy equivalence.
Yeah, like potentiation. Yes, but it does
Right.
lie outside of all potentiation. But
Yeah.
then, like, efficient causes get in the way of a causal nexus, right? Um, but I'm speaking
Mhm.
specifically in terms of the archetypes and the forms which lie outside of subject-object representation. Do they themselves are they like attractor states or um,
Yeah, they are because they're the cause of their participants. They are
okay.
the necessary condition of their being, necessary and sufficient condition. And so they are the end for all things suspended from them. But then they also have a cause above them in unity. And so they are both directed themselves upward to their source and they draw everything that they emanate back to themselves,
All right.
according to Proclus.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. I don't know who is next, and I don't want to just make this like Q&A and everyone takes turns talking with me specifically. So I'm going to try to step back a little bit. And again, I don't know who is here first. So whoever is fastest, jump in.
Um, we once spoke very briefly on a separate space. I kind of stumbled into a pretty specific theological discussion, and I'm stumbling in again. I did for the second time see these conversations, and your exhortation to come and defend the truth overcame me. So I did manage to log in. But I may be breaking form because I think what I expressed briefly the one time we did talk is I've never believed in God. I find, just to pick one part of entry, you representing the forms as something that you can speak of as existing confidently enough to say they are this or are that, to me it's just ridiculous. Because I mean, I guess I'm interested. I don't think it's defensible. Your knowledge of Plato and philosophy is beautiful and extensive, and you're extremely eloquent. But that stance of representing that you are confident enough that these are actual things, that you can make basic copulative propositions, I don't think that can be defended. But this is where
What
I would.
sorts of things do you think have the existence where you can speak of them in that way?
Well, how about the bed? You were speaking of the bed. I think the bed exists, and the example you gave of a dream would be good. The dream does not exist. Certainly the forms. I mean, we could pick those three examples: a dream, a bed, and the forms. Neither the dream nor the forms exist. I think the dream exists more than the forms.
Okay.
Because at least, yeah.
Well, the dream has effects in the world, so it does something, which means it exists. In my opinion, I will
Okay.
agree with Plato and say something exists insofar as it can be acted upon, or it can act upon other things. So the dream has causal effects, therefore it's real.
Beautiful.
I would say the same for mathematical truth. Like the mathematician contemplating abstract structures that may never be, instantiated in physical systems, his behavior is changed by contemplating mathematical truth. And so these mathematicals that he's contemplating have existence because they affect the mathematician.
Okay. I accept these arguments. Well put. Nonetheless, that type of existence is a different type of existence of the bed. And is this what was? I mean, is this what forms are written of? Something that doesn't exist in the material realm, but somehow has a functional, causal existence that can impinge upon the world, even though it doesn't exist in the world.
Yeah, just like the potentiality of the bed preceded the bed, and someone at some point thought of the possibility of the bed. And so that thought
Uh-huh.
in the possibility space had an effect on someone such that they invented the bed as we know it.
Okay. So I'll take. So this is the kind of classical. Would this be called Neoplatonism?
Well, I am a Neoplatonist. That position specifically, I don't know what to call it. I guess it's a Platonic position, sure.
Okay. Okay. So then. Okay. So when you were saying that the forms are this, the forms are that, you're speaking separate from any kind of written tradition, which may have discussed the forms, but these aspects of dreams or intentions, or possibly, like you spoke of sameness itself as divine, which is beautiful. And Aphrodite, I think you kind of gave a glimpse of what Aphrodite might have meant.
The form of the beautiful.
Yeah. So yeah, that is beautiful. Are you familiar with the Sanskrit term Sambhogakaya?
No.
There's in one of the in the Buddhist traditions, they have the three bodies, Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Dharmakaya. The Dharmakaya being the ultimate one, Nirmanakaya being basically the material world or the Buddha, but then Sambhogakaya is this kind of intermediary deity potentiality state. And I've often thought that beauty's essence would be the Sambhogakaya, and of the same order as Aphrodite.
Well, interesting. So are you still maintaining that it's ridiculous to talk about the forms then, or has your mind changed already, or are you coming?
Yeah, I still do think it's ridiculous. I mean, you did answer my objections well. I mean, I'm not disputing that, but I think once you start dragging in the legacy of theology and like, just for instance, just to take one example. Okay, so if Aphrodite exists, is Aphrodite weeping over this giant crater in the refugee camp today? Like I don't think there are any gods. I think that's kind of a beautiful false assumption, but the horrific nihilistic reality is just far more real than these kind of logical extrapolations.
Well, I think the gods in their personas are metaphors for principles that transcend any, literary device such as we can capture them. There's going to be more to beauty than we can fathom. But I mean, you acknowledge there are beautiful things, right?
Indeed.
So do you think beauty is real or not?
It is real.
Right. And it's not just one beautiful thing or another that is real, but beauty itself is something. Just like, gravity is real, and yet it doesn't exist in one place or time. It's everywhere and nowhere. So beauty exists everywhere and nowhere. That's the existence of the form.
Okay, but then beauty is helpless in the face of horror. And this is where I think the monism turning into the good God and associating the good with God will fail in the face of the horrific, inexplicable, unexplained, underivable horror of modernity.
Well, now we're moving on to a different topic. I mean,
Well, but
first,
this is the
can
basis
we?
of me considering why it's ridiculous to speak of the forms as are being a monist who believes in God.
Right. Well, are you acknowledging that the form of the beautiful exists?
I will accept that what I consider to be beautiful, or the faculty of beauty, yes, may exist independent of whatever even horror of modernity. Yes.
Right. And it exists as a potentiality behind any possible world. There could be beautiful things. There could be creatures that would recognize beauty. It would be there, just like gravity could be instantiated in any physical system anywhere. So I think that to me means it's not ridiculous to talk about the form of beauty. In fact, it's sort of presupposed if you're talking about beautiful things.
Okay. I'll. Yeah, I think it's the connection to God, which I haven't heard you kind of discuss, but and maybe justice, and I'll let other people speak, but I would be interested in talking about how justice may or may not be a form also. But it's been nice chatting, and I'll stick around.
Okay, sure.
And others, he did exhort us not to treat him like a pastor, so they should just leap in and interrupt.
Yeah,
please.
I'll try interrupting. Maybe not the concept of justice itself, but maybe like an archetype that employs justice in its foundation. Like maybe the just ruler, right? The archetype of the benevolent king or something. He would be just, right?
Sure. And
that could be perfect and beautiful in its own way, right? And reach that kind of level of sophistication that would warrant that kind of form.
I like that example.
I could just defend like a standard nominalist interpretation. Like, what does beauty mean outside of all instances of beautiful things, right? Like, it seems like conceptually our spatiotemporal like forms of thought kind of contextualize beauty in all beautiful things. So like, what's the meaning outside of that?
Well, the meaning would be the potential to create these forms, even if they aren't yet actual. Like, you can imagine all beautiful things. That leads you to be able to imagine other similar things that share the same property. So it's creative, it's originative. It's not simply all the stuff as a catalog of what we find in terms of beautiful objects. It's like a potency that is a source of beauty.
Okay, yeah, that's probably what I'd say to a nominalist too. So.
And if we were to try to define beauty, beauty is a difficult example for this, but our definition would not be about any of the particular beautiful things because they differ in many respects. Our definition would have to be of what is common amongst them. And if there is something that's common amongst them, well, that must be some one thing. And there are other properties, like there might be a beautiful song or a beautiful play or a beautiful piece of literature or a beautiful maiden or something like that. But if we're going to define beauty, we're looking to something that's common amongst them, that's the same in all those cases. And so Proclus's argument is that definitions are of what is common to the whole group of that kind of thing. And so if there's definitions.
What's the definition of beauty then? Like in words? Like, just give it to me.
I feel beauty was demonstrated to me through Arvel's mode of argumentation without him defining it.
But even if we can't define it, if we are able to speak about there being something common to all beautiful things, that has to be some one thing, and they differ in other respects, but they don't differ insofar as they're beautiful.
Yeah, and I think this kind of could you define beauty line of reasoning is a kind of dead end, because can you define the color red? At some point,
that's the point I was trying to make, though, that it's just like a purely qualitative, axiomatic form of experience.
But do you deny that beautiful things exist?
I don't know. Conclusions aren't really my thing. So. Because I seem to experience beauty, but you can experience all sorts of nominals, right?
I don't exactly follow. So you don't deny that beauty exists, yet you insist upon wanting a definition of it. And thereby,
well, I was asking for a definition to demonstrate that any like concept of beauty would have to be axiomatic, purely qualitative, and pre-definitional. So, yeah, that was the point, like I just said.
What's wrong with just saying appealing to the senses?
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying is right. Right.
I mean, it's subjective, but it's a definition.
Yeah, but I mean, insofar as it is subjective, you can still talk about the concept as a potentiality, something to be actualized.
Whoever's
Which means
typing,
that,
please mute.
yeah. So if sorry, just kind of lost my train of thought there.
No, well, subjectivity is the. I mean, subjectivity killed the transcendent, and conceiving of ourselves as mere perception bodies with no connection to anything universal is certainly the default modern frame.
Yeah, when you said like the bed exists, isn't it just a sense perception?
No, I would claim the bed does exist.
It's just like a sense perception. Like you could be a brain in a vat. It could be like, a false sense perception.
Well, the depths of skepticism and disbelief in the actual world, to me, they're more a function of political propaganda, but they do have vibrance in philosophical circles too.
So I wonder what's like the arguability of believing in beauty, right? So like some libtard says like a transgender black woman doing whatever is beautiful and this expression of diversity and whatever. Like, what's your counter argument to that? Like, what's universal? I should say like epistemic capability does the quote unquote form of the beautiful have?
It's an excellent question.
You could just say it's not subjectively beautiful to me.
Yeah, that's the only position where you can say
I
no, that's
disagree.
not beautiful.
The right position is that the entire woke mind virus that birthed it is somehow I guess you could I would explain it as it derives from a conspiracy, a hidden lie, but it's fundamental enough that it births seeming forms, like seeming beauty. But the fact that it ultimately at a higher level derives from a lie or a fraud makes any derivative beauty ugly. And that's why we perceive it to be ugly, because we know it's deriving from a lie.
Yeah, and in that sense, I would also say that, well, there's kind of tried and true beauty that seems to, well, if a society aligns with a classical notion of beauty, it seems to thrive. Whereas if you follow this lie, seems like God will be the arbiter, and it's a kind of ongoing trial by combat. I don't think the ugly societies will have stable iterations towards eternity, if that's a decent kind of way of approaching this.
So, I mean, to me, that seems to be like privileging your sense of the beautiful over someone else's seeming sense of the same beautiful form, right?
Well, it wouldn't be me privileging it. I could, for instance, I could have a completely perverted aesthetic sense, and that would be punishing in the longest.
Okay. Evidently, everyone's gone from the the Jitsi call. I'm not sure what happened. That's strange. I don't think I like inadvertently kicked everyone. That's wild. Let me try this again. All right. Another tech support stream. Let's join. Will they all be in there? Okay. Strange. Hey, so that
You're saying
wasn't
there's an
broadcast.
objective
Anything
beauty
you guys
then?
were just saying was not broadcast. You all like disappeared from me, so I had to exit and rejoin. Whoever was speaking for the last minute, go ahead and repeat yourself.
Oh, I wanted to ask a question to John, I think was, so you're saying there's this objective beauty that's, like, predicated on the flourishing and destructive nature of, um, if you believe it's beautiful or not?
It's more if you go into something with let's say there is the beautiful, and you live your life with a kind of warped notion of this, will that be punished in some way uh, by simply not being a stable system?
It
So it really doesn't matter where what any individual might think is beautiful in that sense. What matters is uh, which beauty is productive.
Okay. I feel though that's a bit conflating two different things. So would you say that I mean there's certainly notions of non-destructive. I mean, I agree like if you would just say something like oh shooting myself in the head's beautiful, people who believe that aren't going to thrive or flourish obviously. But is would you say that then there's no examples of non-destructive beauty or even like a measure of beauty? So like let's say I think a red rose is more beautiful than a blue rose. Is there an objective truth value in that?
I think it's within, but again, what I think is kind of besides the point. But I think that kind of more subtle distinction is within the realm of stability and stable iteration and harmonious existence. It won't really have dire consequences. Whereas, say, yeah, your first example there, obviously, quite
Yeah,
dire.
there's so you're saying as long as it's beautiful, it's beautiful. It doesn't matter if it's more or less. Like that's not a important distinction in your view.
Well, it is towards eternity, but in, say, a human perspective, in our limited being, then uh, there are different degrees of effectivity, or yeah, I wouldn't know the proper term there, but
Fitness.
I want to
fitness.
ask
Yeah,
a questions, but I don't want to soak up the room or anything.
Real quick, the Platonic line on this is that all things have beauty because beauty is, in some sense, the same as form. So a beautiful thing concentrates the formal over the material. Something that instantiates many principles, if you just compare it with your own aesthetic intuitions, is going to be a beautiful work of art, like a piece of literature that captures the human condition, that articulates, principles underlying society and great themes. Like this is what we perceive as beautiful in artificial things. And then the perfect specimen of a species that displays the archetypal nature that all of the different individuals are aspiring to, that embodies its form more. So the more beautiful member of the species is more formal. It is closer to that archetypal form that proper anatomy is aimed at for that species. You can't exist because existence is tied with formal contents without having some level of beauty. And so we can have different abilities to recognize beauty, but the fact that people disagree, I mean, people disagree about mathematical truth, but the people who disagree, like somebody's going to be wrong, is the thing. So we recognize experts in society, in aesthetics, movie studios hire people who have a good eye for who has the right kind of physiognomy for a role, who's going to fit in the overall cinematography. Uh, we treat it as though recognition of beauty is a faculty that can be trained. So just the 2 points there. Ontologically, everything has beauty, and then especially beautiful things are conspicuously embodying many universal formal principles, and the material in them is subsidiary. Like gray goo is ugly because it's like gross matter. We don't see form in it. Whereas some, fractal Mandelbrot thing that's highly formal, highly beautiful because of that.
So isn't then
yeah.
the transvestite protesting for wokeism also as beautiful as Botticelli by that definition?
Well, no, because there's a dissonance in themselves between their given nature and what they are embodying. And that dissonance is preventing them from like being the form that they naturally are. And by embodying that form that you naturally are, you fit into a wider society, into a family, into a community in an organic fashion. So like they are deviating from their form in that they're deviating from their place. Aristotle in I think his On the Heavens talks about the cause of gravity and levity as the middle bodies aspiring to their natural place, and to get to their natural place, he equates with getting to their form. I don't know why I had to throw that in there. I just did, but like, yeah, to be in your proper place is to also embody your proper form. Those are not disconnected. Like the relations you have to others are also part of your formal makeup. Just like obviously a plant species is not actualized, is not complete and full unless it lives in its ecosystem. So the transvestite is going against its organic, holistic existence. It's deviating from his or her proper place, and so is not embodying those formal principles as well.
I have a question though. You said everything is beautiful, so you would say it is beautiful, but just less beautiful than your other examples?
Yes, there is some
Okay.
beauty in it. That's what allows it to have. I mean, there is a form of the transvestite in some sense. I shouldn't say that because there aren't forms of monstrosities. There are forms of naturally occurring real things, and then there are many, indefinitely many, deviations from the true form. So transvestite is just a common deviation, but like they're obviously one form putting on another form artificially, and that's why it doesn't all jive together. And yet the two forms that they're trying to put together had reality, had beauty. That's why they subsisted. The masculine and the feminine had their own independent beauties. If you try to cacophonously combine them, then uh, they won't be as beautiful as when they
So
stay
you're
in their
saying
proper
like
lane.
the most beautiful things are things that are like in accordance with their form. So you would say like defecating and stuff is like probably one of the most beautiful things.
uh like Well, not exactly. So that's something that we do organically. I mean, I guess I would say because excrement. I hate this, so I don't like that you brought this up.
I'm sorry.
Um, I
I didn't want to do
it's very in the
an awful
spirit of
example,
like
but I kind of have to do an
Socrates.
awful
Yeah, yeah.
example to make
It's
the
like
point. You
Socrates
know.
bringing up the catamite in the Gorgias. Yeah, yeah. I got to deal with this. Well, that's a good point. So there are things that are part of the natural cycle of a living creature that seem not to be beautiful, like defecation, and yet like there's also our ability to perceive what's beautiful in it. So the feces, or again, I hate that I have to talk about it, but
I'm sorry.
the feces is attractive to other species of insect and bacteria that are going to break it down and reabsorb it into the ecosystem. It's going to be food for other things. So it is like food is the object of desire, and the proper object of all desire is the beautiful in Neoplatonic terms, like strictly speaking. So something is finding that beautiful. Something is teleologically drawn to it, not us. But I guess that's like we what we produce
Wait, when you
there will
say
be a
not us,
grade.
isn't that subjective? I thought
Say
it was
again?
like because it's just a specific point when you say not for us, but for another entity. Isn't that like
Yeah, yeah.
completely subjective?
Well, yes, and that's the point that I'm making is that
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. Okay.
objectively, it's all beautiful. Objectively, everything is perfectly good. That's like saying the only really real being is the good itself in some ultimate sense. So, from God's point of view, everything, including feces and everything else, is perfectly good. But we see it in a limited, finite respect. We don't see all of the applications and uses of our excrement, our lowest product. but everything produces whatever it perfects itself insofar as it can, and then it goes on to be creative, and there's a hierarchy of its creations. Like there are the things that are most closely embodying your potencies and your creative potential, and then there's a spectrum leading down to the last of the things that you create. So there has to be the last of the things that are created. The one doesn't just create the forms, the one also creates gross matter, which is in some sense the ugliest of things because it's the absence of all form. So the one, you could call matter like the excrement of the one, and yet even that matter has a kind of beauty in its role in the cosmos because the cosmos is beautiful. So taken from a holistic view, even the lowest things will have some kind of beauty. So even yes, defecation has a form of beauty, but understandably, for the role that we play and for what our proper goods are, we're not going to perceive the good of feces like a dung beetle will.
Yeah, your
So the
definition is
universe,
definitely coherent, but I'm just saying, like, when people are talking about objective classical beauty, I don't think that would really fit that criteria necessarily still, but your definition is consistent for sure.
Well, Plato, will always talk about the highest example of a thing. If you pay careful attention to his metaphors, when he has the choice to choose between different professions, like, yeah, Socrates mentions mundane professions, but that's because he has to for a point. But it's always like the most excellent of the thing in question. So the classical notion of beauty, and also like what he explicitly says in the Republic, is that we should surround ourselves with the most conspicuous embodiments of form so that we facilitate this ladder of beauty journey. And it's easy for us to see the universal. It's hard for us to see what is universally beautiful in feces because that's an inferior, like maybe the most inferior of our products. uh, Whereas, things that are more classically beautiful are going to lead us upward in that ascent faster. There
Like
is
we
a
breathe air, but
entropy.
it's like plant
There
farts.
is an entropy chat. Um, so L Slade regarding the establishment's mystics for $15. Thank you very much. Teilhard de Chardin influenced lots of globalist social planners and New Age thinkers, such as the Batesons and various people tied to Esalen and Finhorn. I looked those up earlier. I didn't know about them, but they are like New Age spiritualist communities. This is a topic that I've never dived into all the way. I'd like to get further into it. Apollonian Germ in the past has talked about it. Some other, quasi researchers online have delved into it. But the connection between like globalist thinkers and some of these weird New Age movements, like the Masons, like some people argue that Mor- Mormonism was started by the Masons. So like elite, uh, you know, Anglo-American establishment, Jewish establishment uh, powers somehow are related to all of these like fringe sects. And of course, we know that like Manson and his cult was fueled by drugs provided by, I don't know if it was the CIA or which outfit in particular. He was part of what's like the most stereotypical psyop program,
MK
MK
Ultra.
Ultra. Yes, thank you. He was like part of MK Ultra, and so yeah, there is this weird connection. Also, I have maintained for a long time that I think the globalist powers, Teilhard de Chardin, of course, was a Catholic theologian and mystic, but that he like was favorable to evolution. Some like Rad Cat types really dislike Chardin, but yeah, I've maintained for a long time that the globalists who are really in power are perennialists. They have a worldview very close to mine, basically, but they take a left-hand path. And um, even people that I respect, like Joseph Campbell, basically argues for a kind of left-hand path perennialism if you listen to his lectures. Um, and yeah, it makes sense if the true philosophy gives you power, then the people who are going to be most dominant in the world will have the most of the true philosophy with the critical kind of deviation that allows them to be invested in the world. So left hand path facilitates more love of money, love of power, and everything like that. So it's just kind of who you would expect. If like my philosophy was right, it's who you would expect to be in power. Not that it's only my philosophy, like plenty of people are perennialists out there.
Are you confident that if you had as much power and wealth, you would stay on the true path?
No, not at all. So poverty is a blessing.
Yeah, the Masons, they like in their literature and the books that they write, like Morals and Dogma by Albert Pike, yeah, it's identical to um, aspects of perennialism. Like it's one for one. They talk about the sun and the moon, the forms, Kabbalah, all of that.
Right. And even Platonism, like there's kind of dark Platonism that we rub up against in our own circles. Like Peter Thiel is a Straussian Platonist. Um, so there's the people at the top are going to be close to the truth in one respect or another, but they always take some left hand turn at some point.
Yeah, in Morals and Dogma, it was written by Albert Pike. He like predicted World War One and World War Two while being like a Confederate soldier in America. He says World War Three will be between the Jews and the Muslims, but basically he has a whole section where he talks about Plato for like hours, and he breaks down what would happen in the Eleusinian Mysteries, and the guy is like a top sage in the priest class system. So
This is Morals and Dogmas.
yeah, Morals and Dogma by Albert
Yeah,
Pike. It's like the hardest book I've ever read.
I've wanted to read it for a long time. No, Masons are basically Platonists. I mean, they all worship the demiurge.
Oh yeah,
You know,
their number one thing is elusive, which whenever you break it down, it's like a rape ritual, according to Albert Pike.
yes. Just to reinforce the importance of having this show, we need to discuss philosophy, including the Platonic foundations. But I'm not like saying this has to be a Platonist show. But anyway, it is important to get to the bottom of this because the people in power have their own philosophy, and we had better understand it if we're going to predict their behavior. So, all right.
Just as a partial aside, I was earlier reading Paolo Sarpi, who was this kind of Henry Kissinger of the Venetian age. And he was talking about the Jesuits and how the Jesuits would share all the secrets that the princes were confessing to them and use that to control the world.
Yeah, the idea of confession sounds like an intelligence gathering scheme from the beginning.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I have very mixed feelings about the church. Most people watching probably know that.
And Jesus had no notion of the church.
Well, I mean, he had a notion of a church, but when I even look at like
Wasn't that
the
Paul?
earliest, huh?
Wasn't that Paul, not Jesus?
No, Jesus, says that you're the rock that I'm going to found my church on, roughly paraphrased. Or you are Peter, and on this rock I'm going to found my church. Jesus talks about the church. But when you read the earliest of the church fathers' documents, it does seem like it was more intended to be a relatively open philosophical community. The elders had moral authority, and they were basically like they had the same role that the legalistic rabbis would have, but rabbis, of course, had an open kind of philosophical debate going, and you could go in all sorts of different directions. But it seems like the Christians at a certain point gave up, I don't know, the confidence in the Holy Spirit, or it was the church elites who decided to close down the possibility of being challenged. Maybe they were tired of being challenged, and uh, yeah, I don't know. I think like the ideal church. I talked about this relatively recently, a few months ago. I feel like the intention of the church is something that is necessary in order to have philosophical dialogue. You have to have a moral community. Because like we're not jumping in, interrupting each other. We're abiding by certain moral norms, even to have a truly philosophical conversation. And that's pre-philosophical. But it's like the purpose of the church, I think, could be that domain for the Holy Spirit to act. You need to protect it somehow. You need to establish the norms somehow. And where can those come from? Like ethics comes from philosophy, explicit ethical propositions, but norms of the discourse have to be there in order to even begin a discussion of ethics. So there has to be something pre-philosophical setting the tone and establishing what you do and what you don't do in the conversation. So it's like something like the church would be the perfect institution, but I don't know exactly what went wrong or when.
Yeah, I am a Catholic myself, but I could not escape the Jesuit question. I do think that it actually kind of reinforced my faith even more because it would make sense that the most subverted would be the truest kind of Christianity. Like whenever you trace the money, all the money's in the Vatican. Like
Mhm.
it makes sense that all of these guys they would orient towards that place.
Right. Yeah, the best, when corrupted, becomes the worst. So in a way, to find the true church, you should look for the worst church and, find like the pure version of it.
Yeah, and I wanted
So
for
Mormonism,
actually
again,
that reason, I
pure
wanted
version.
to ask you: do you think that if all of the wealth, all of the power, I guess you would say, if this theory is true, if the top of the demonic hierarchy is the Vatican, how would you trace that through like Hilbert space? How would what is the correlation there?
Oh, geez. Yeah. Well, you're kind of talking about like the figure of Satan and the so-called archetype of evil. Satan, I've talked about this before too, my thoughts on it. I don't think Satan is an archetypal being in the same way that the Avatar is. The Avatar has necessity from himself, but there is like a peak evil strategy that doesn't have a unitive inner nature because evil is departure from good. Good is the source of form. So, and form is the source of being. So, evil departing from the good departs from being by its nature. So, like pure evil in itself doesn't have self subsistence. Proclus talks about evil as a parasitical being, it's a par hypostasis. A hypostasis, of course, is like the real underlying, like pre essence that allows something to truly be. There are three genuine hypostases: soul, nous, and then the one. Uh, and evil doesn't have a hypostasis of its own. It doesn't self-subsist. Souls have like mathematically inevitable existence. Uh, the forms have metaphysically necessary existence. The one is beyond existence in a superessential, inevitable way, as like it's impossible to conceive of anything absent it. But then beyond soul, things become more contingent, and they don't have self-subsisting necessity. Like a particular error, a mathematical error, doesn't have necessity. Maybe in the fullness, like if you run out all attempts to solve math, all errors are inevitably going to happen. But any particular error doesn't have the kind of necessity that the true answer has. Again, arguably, all things have ultimate necessity, maybe. But getting a problem wrong, it's like it's not necessary that you got it wrong and specifically that way. And so evil, any departure from the true course, is no particular evil is the necessary one, just like there's no archetype of the monstrosity or mutation away from the proper form of a thing. If I'm born with three arms, there isn't the form of the three-armed man. It's just that there's been a mistake and I missed the form that I was aiming at. So evil, as that departure, it draws its subsistence and its therefore its causal efficacy from good things. It takes the good powers of other things and combines them in an inharmonious way, just like the transvestite that we talked about earlier. So that's the nature of evil. And that being said, there won't be one unitive, perfectly evil being, because it's not a self-subsisting being like the avatar as the perfect soul would be. But there is nevertheless like the approach, there's the limit that we can draw to the peak parasitical strategy. So that thing is going to be visible in Hilbert space as like a vortex structure,
Yeah,
drawing a
so
bunch of energy.
it's kind of like a will that is aiming towards nothing, right? And so then it would be an error. Does that make sense? Because you do will evil, like that is the Christian conception of evil. Like you read Augustine, read Aquinas, you might agree with him or you might not. I don't agree with him on everything, but it is a will, right?
Well, it's an
Can you
will
express it?
that turns us there. Go ahead, Tomer.
Yeah, can you express it maybe as self-interest will, like every good being, like that has a function in the cosmos, when it becomes self-interest, is becoming self-referential and then not reverting back to the one and becoming this vortex you described.
I would definitely support that. Yeah, and to answer, I don't know what I call the cross icon guy. What should we call you? Name?
I don't want to dox myself. It's a very liberal college, but
Okay, how about Jerry? Can we call you Jerry?
yeah,
All right,
Jerry.
So yeah, I think there is cat. I just derailed my own train of thought. Jerry's just too silly of a name. Like,
Just as a brief aside, while you gather your thoughts again, I was reading Herodotus yesterday, and there
I'm
was
never going to
this.
come back if we go to this now. Someone
No,
remind me.
it's connected. It's connected.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll be brief. It was an imputed speech of a ruler, and basically the ruler went wrong, and the Greek word was basically when he came to power, he was influenced by diabole. And I looked it up, and it basically diabole means slander. And I looked up the Latin. So diabolus, like diabolical, I think comes from diabole. So that the only etymology I could find of diabolical means basically misleading people. So anyway,
Yeah, that is connected.
Yeah,
and that's
the
a
highest.
So the connection.
You can go on.
I was just going to say the connection there is what he was saying about all things. Well, Plato would say all things seek the good, and everyone wills the good, and no one wills evil intentionally. Whereas maybe these Christian authors are saying that we do willfully choose evil, but only insofar, I think, as we recognize it as a local good to ourselves. So it's a distortion of what is actually greater and what is less, because we're too wrapped up in our own perceptions, because we're too localized, we're too self-centered. Certain things seem to be very large, like someone who's going to steal something that it is only worth like a few dollars to them, but then they damage property and cause a much larger loss to the people they're stealing from. Like clearly net, that's like for the worse. But because they're only thinking about their own role in it, they're going to choose evil, but only because from that self-centered perspective, they're maximizing their good. So you could say
I
that's
think
choosing evil, but
you're going down a false path if you accept selfishness as a code for evil.
it's not the same.
I think that's, and then
Yeah,
like the whole
you can
dichotomy
recognize
between
there's
there's
greater and
so
lesser.
many.
There's greater
I
and
heard-
lesser selfishness, right?
Oh yeah,
well, fine,
And there's an
but
appropriate level of selfishness, right?
well, right, but Tomer was making it out like self orientation itself is negative.
No, I didn't mean it that way. I just meant that when you are so self-centered that you don't see how your action, how your function serve also the cosmos, how you play your proper role, then you become self-referential in the sense that you make a mistake and you don't go back to reality,
right.
to the run. And I also wanted to say something, that's why I joined, about the topic of beauty, that I accept Schopenhauer's definition of beauty, that it is an apprehension of the form divorced from the causality of the principle of sufficient reason, meaning that it's free from the contingency of the relations, of the self-interest of the will. That's when an artist creates a great work of art, you don't see it as repulsive or attractive. You recognize the inherent idea behind this work of art. So, like you mentioned, I don't know who mentioned it, but you mentioned the modern art of the walk, which is repulsive. That's exactly missing the mark of beauty, because it is directly associated with the will, with attraction or repulsion.
Yeah, I'm a architect major and planning to go into architecture, and that is a struggle that I'm going to have to. I want to capture the form of a good, but I'm building a building, so it is or making a plan for it. So I am operating within the principle of sufficient reason and contingency, but I do think that there are ways that we can access these forms, or at least figure out like the effects that they have in their emanation into the world of contingency. So how would a Platonist approach this, um, approach architecture in that sense, in the beauty of architecture and capturing it by the will, by willing it?
Well, I think Schopenhauer's notion of beauty there as the target of like the higher desire, there is will, there is desire inherent even for Neoplatonists in apprehension of intelligible forms in themselves, like contemplating mathematical structures. There is a desire. I mean, you couldn't think unless there was a teleological aim, like we're thinking in a particular direction that seems relevant and attractive to us. So even intelligible things, there is an eros or desire guiding us to that. Schopenhauer, I guess, in thinking of will, he's thinking of the subject of willing versus the subject of representation, subject of knowing, I should say. And I think that negates the fact that an act of knowledge already pre-contains an act of will. They mutually entail, as Damascius says in his commentary on the Philebus, like you cannot have an act of knowledge separated from uh, the pleasure that accompanies the fulfillment of intellectual desire. Like to know is to fulfill an act of cognition. To fulfill that act, there had to be that draw towards the thing that you're contemplating. So that's, I think, where Schopenhauer goes wrong. Schopenhauer, though, I think goes right in talking about the particulars of architecture. So it's divorcing from particular willful contingency by exhibiting the universal potencies of specifically gravity, light, and I guess form. Schopenhauer articulates some more things. You should actually read From the World as Will and Representation, specifically his comments on architecture, if you haven't.
Yeah, I've just been rereading like book one, The World as Representation, and book two of The World as Will, just over and over and over again, taking notes on it just so then I could really have it down. I haven't read book three and book four yet. I've read the beginning of book three when Schopenhauer talks about how Kant and Plato, they actually are very, they're both aiming towards the same thing almost. Of course, Plato's way better than Kant. But I also wanted to ask you, since you said that knowledge is, even whenever you don't enact it, that is an act of will.
Mhm.
So is it like an ousia? Is that how you reconcile Kant and Plato?
Is what exactly the ousia?
Willing knowledge, like thinking a thought. That, and since I know the will and the forms that are kind of the same, but and I accept a non-dualist perspective. So the way that Kant talks about a concept, Schopenhauer says that it is wrong in the sense that, or his sense of idea, it is wrong, and Plato got it right. So is thinking an act of will that falls outside of the forms, and it's a concept that is internal, that is still within the subject object representation, or is it also like an ousia that is perceived only whenever you break down representation? Like, I know that probably sounds
Okay, yeah,
complicated, but
it's a little bit complicated. The authentic existence of thinking is in thought thinking itself. So it is in intellect itself, where the intellect, the intellectual process of intelligence, and then the intelligible nature are not separate. They are non-dual, and there it is ousia. But when they're, uh, separated, then the activity, you're talking about the activity of a substance that has intelligible nature as its goal, and there that's more having to do with, I think, the procession and reversion back from the arche of a thing. So if you've proceeded away from the forms that gave rise to you, and you are trying to intellectually perceive those forms which are your source, then that's a vertical movement through the hypostases, and that's your essence aspiring to return to its source. So there, as a thinker, your intellect has an ousia, in essence, and that willing the intelligible is that ousia making contact with a higher essence. But if the authentic existence, again, of thinking is going to be unitive.
Is thought then predetermined in the unity, and we can't have our own thoughts that are not set by God?
No, that's the this correlation between thinking, or I would say deliberation, and willing is interesting. I haven't read Schopenhauer too much enough to really
it's been killing
follow,
me.
but in Aristotle's Ethics and in the Gorgias, there, like in Aristotle's Ethics, for example, that reiterates the point in the Gorgias that willing follows deliberation, where you cannot will something if you don't think that is better. And then in where, like, that seems like we're talking about final ends, like comparing, but in Aristotle's Ethics, he uses deliberation like when he's talking about whether or not there's free will, in terms of sort of the means where we deliberate, or the faculty of deliberation, which this is reminding me that that willing is tied to the correlation between willing and thinking is to deliberation, in terms of Aristotle's distinction that you deliberate about courses, perhaps of action, but maybe even opinions in general. And well, you willing, say, conquest or something is for something else. And if you cease to think, or if you deliberate that certain conquest wouldn't be advantageous, then you would cease to will the conquest. You still kind of will the end that you're after, but you deliberate about the means.
But same thing, all things seek the good. So the ultimate end of our thought is the truth and all intelligible reality. And so the end of our thought is fixed, but it's like the one mountain, many paths to ascend it kind of thing.
Yeah, would you say that Plato's kind of tripartite distinction would refuse to place will? I mean, like when we speak about will generally, sometimes there's a correlation with, like, I don't know, base desires. I kind of am trying to imply that willing is like common to all those three faculties of like thumos, the appetites, and reason.
Mhm.
I don't really know where I'm going with this kind of aporia.
Yeah, maybe we can distinguish between the appetite and the wisdom part of the will, that the artistic vision of beauty is more connected with the wisdom, and the appetite, repulsive, attractive, like the walk art is connected to the appetite.
Which is connected to the body, which is connected to space and time, which involves motion.
Which is inferior to God.
Well, yes, which involves motion, though. So the kind
Which
of
is ridiculous.
that the
I mean,
world is
that's just,
inferior to the principle behind the world. Like
yeah. That's, I mean,
instantiations are
this is the
inferior to their
idealist
archetype.
fallacy.
Instantiations are inferior to their archetypes because the archetype is the cause of the instantiation, and the archetype has a more
Yeah,
absolute and
and yeah, and
ubiquitous
this is
existence.
exactly why forms are ridiculous. And speaking of that structure, you're saying that you actually gave the example earlier that the universe is God's excrement.
No, I said,
and you analogized the inferiority of matter.
yeah,
to
matter
God.
itself, not the world.
I don't think that
Oh.
matter itself, I don't think matter in nature itself, made in the form that God intended it to be made in, is bad, but matter in contingency, where a false will towards the good, it disrupts the beauty of nature. Like you guys were talking about, like theses and all that. Aleister Crowley, well-known Satanist, right? He knew about forms. He would negate the forms by literally eating theses. Like, that is a will away from the forms.
Okay, can we go back for a
That's
moment? Because that,
contingency.
for what it's worth, reminded me of where I wanted to go with Tomer's comment. So there is an intention and a will behind the creation, even of the forms themselves. And so when you appreciate the being of the form, it's not divorced from will there. It's just that the will for the form to be what it is from above. And it's an eternal will because the forms are eternal. The paradigms, the archetypes, the laws of nature are eternal. And they are created because they're harmonious, because they're stable, as we talked about earlier with John. By the way, any of you guys can turn on your camera. I can't because Rumble is using my camera and it already displays my image on Rumble. So anyone who wants to turn on your camera, please do. But yeah, I was saying, like, the appreciation of beauty detached from your own motion is like sharing in the will of God. So it's still involved in will, but it's a higher will. It's from above down to the form, and you're like participating in that. And then on the other hand, you as a bodily creature, the desires that you have move you because things in the corporeal world are in generation, they're in motion, they're becoming to be. And so you're in incomplete pursuit where, like, you have to physically move yourself to get to the objects of your desire. And appreciation of beauty, you stop that kind of motion and participate in the higher kind of will that, let's say, God has for the forms and beauty itself.
Yeah, would you say that we're willing wholeness, insofar as wholeness is self-sufficiency or something?
When we're contemplating like aesthetic beauty?
Well, as like partial or not self independent, not
self-subsisting.
Like we have some, yeah, we don't have total completion where we obviously require goods outside of ourselves.
Yeah, I would say probably partial nature's desire to be part of the whole that they should be part of, because that's part of their proper form. Like a part, insofar as it is a part, is meant to be a part of a particular whole. So you desire that wholeness. Do you desire to like become the whole? It seems sort of cancerous, I guess. So we
Right.
desire wholeness, but like a proportional kind of wholeness.
Yeah, like integrating the shadow in that sense, kind of like in Jungian terms.
Yeah, there we're looking for a wholeness, but not, to be the whole of humanity because we're a part of like the form of man somehow, so we need to like be all men, which would be ridiculous. That'd be like the totalizing of the ego that Tomer was talking about. That's part and parcel of the path of evil. Okay,
So
we can move on now,
you're
Christian, if you want. Go ahead.
well, so you're certain that the higher or the transcendent or the forms are better because you called them eternal, because they're just kind of there, and thereby that's somehow better than us who are not eternal, and thereby that's
Well, they're more powerful,
that.
right?
No, I would say they're completely powerless because they don't exist at all and they don't even matter.
But
I
once
mean,
again,
they're
we
so
acknowledge
fundamental.
that
Like,
like
are you going to
beautiful
call
things.
space powerful? Like, space is,
Okay, how
inescapable,
about
but it's not.
yeah? How about gravity? Is gravity itself more powerful than the particular gravity of any particular object?
I would, you saying gravity itself is just an animal uttering a sound. Like, why would you even think that you have a way to grasp what you're painting, this dream that it even is this principle which you can't know, and you're basing this assumption of the
No, it's a
transcendental.
hypothesis. It's a hypothesis in a
Okay,
worldview that's meant
okay,
to
well, at least you.
explain things in the world better. So if you don't posit the existence of gravity, then you can't explain things in physical terms. And just
You can
saying,
measure gravity.
yeah, you can measure particular perturbations of the gravitational field,
Yeah, to like
but
15 decimal places. But
right,
you
but that doesn't mean that the
Phenomenological.
gravitational field in itself, apart from particular instances of it, doesn't have a reality.
but that you can't even endow it with a unity, since we don't even have a unifying law to explain what it is. We're ignorant.
It's an objectification of the same will gravity is. That's in electricity. That's in all other forces of nature.
And this is just not. I mean, that's so
Well,
vulgar. And
Schopenhauerian theory, that's one way of articulating what is gravity. But the point
primitive.
is, it's an inference to the best explanation, and that's what science does. Sometimes science has to posit things that aren't immediately evident to the senses, like the electron. We believe that electrons exist. We don't see electrons. We see the effects, presumably, of electrons. We don't see electrons
But see,
themselves.
if you're using inference to know that there's God, that's so weak, and you can't participate in the passions. But you have passion, and thereby I claim it's not inference.
Okay, the idea, the approach, as described in the various dialogues and Neoplatonic writings, is we use a hypothetico-deductive scientific method to have the best explanations we can of the world so that we can ascend beyond particular bits of knowledge to a theory of the world and a theory of knowledge that completes our like dianoetic process of creation in our image, right? We are, so let me just explain this. As souls, we are dianoetic things, we're like mathematical things, and we are trying to encapsulate bodily reality right now in dianoetic fashion. We're turning what we see into propositions. We also turn our intuitions into propositions. That's what we do at the human soul level with the creation of our theories. So with Platonism, we try to create the best propositions and hypotheses to create a complete system. And I would argue that the forms are necessary to have that complete system. But then once you have that, and also, like,
Which
for what
you
it's worth,
don't.
I'm just going to say, like, Maimonides in Guide for the Perplexed, the famous medieval rabbi, agrees with this, probably because he was also kind of an Aristotelian Platonist. First, and Neoplatonists believe this too, first you master empirical science, physical science, and then you ascend to metaphysical principles and truth. Because that's the ladder of beauty. You go from particulars up to the universals, and then have that complete theory, and then use that to train your mind to reach to the grounds of dianoetic reason, inference. So, like with Euclid, you train the mathematical process so that you can understand the necessity of the axioms for yourself. You truly grasp the necessity of the axioms.
You earlier quoted Aristotle on meteorology,
on the heavens. Yeah,
on the heavens. Does it give you pause that they falsely presumed the Earth was the center of the world?
No, because it was the best explanation they could come up with.
Right, but then you can see how the logical deductions are completely divorced from reality.
Well, no,
and can just be tautological.
No, there was all sorts of stuff that Aristotle and Plato got right, and early scientists and pre-Socratic philosophers got right. And they go to the best explanation,
But
and
they
then
got
when a
the
better
entire
explanation
fucking
gets
universe
better,
wrong.
Yeah, but they were the
this
first
is
people
where-
to try theorizing in the way that they did, and their method of theorizing, and like they didn't get
I'm just
everything
saying, but
wrong.
this
They
is,
got like the
but
shape of the
you're
Earth
trying,
right.
from my point of view, you are anachronistically embodying their error.
Well, that's not a self-evident fact that the heliocentric cosmos is right. But Christian, if somebody says that, like, we can know the particulars, like someone might know that a knife is sharp, obviously.
Yes.
How could they know that the knife is sharp without knowing what sharpness is? Like every single.
I think most everyone knows it's sharp without knowing anything about sharpness itself.
Or how could we know that something
I mean,
is
that's just
double
some
or
like
something
logical,
else or half? This isn't a
it's
trick.
propositional.
We cannot know that something is double without knowing what double is.
Form of poetry, propositional poetry.
Compared to what?
That is not an argument.
I mean, I am thereby, I guess, slandering the errors of philosophy, but it's a beautiful propositional system that has no intrinsic priority to reality.
So Plato didn't just create poetry. He also created a research institution. He also developed theories of matter and theories of universals and stuff that has endured and been useful. And I'm not claiming he got everything right, but specifically when it comes to the issue of the forms, like modern science doesn't have an answer for what the forms were meant to provide in the Platonic worldview. The problem of universals, the problem as he's referencing, like we recognize the same thing in many particular instances. What is the one thing that we're recognizing in the many instances? Why does linguistic reference work? I mean, basically, you're kind of going back to a kind of nominalist position where there isn't one universal pattern that these things are instantiating. The universal is not real, only the particulars. But then why does it work to call individual particulars by a given name? Why does the act of reference work? Why do we all know what we're talking about if there isn't the one thing that is real, that is shared in common between all the instances? Why does language work like that?
Well, it's breaking down because the words you're claiming give you confidence enough to, make this your worldview, do not track for me. So either you're right or I'm wrong.
Okay, you would say that the Earth is not the center, but you would have to know what the center is
or
know
neither
that the
of us.
Earth is not the center.
I mean, any. I mean, I told you. I mean, I do not think it. I think. I mean, you make interesting points about the form like qualities. I mean, it is interesting. But I think you're on difficult ground. I mean, I think getting the entire world wrong and making false kind of deductions that then you're applying to the physical world, which don't
Getting the entire world wrong. What are
actually
you
end up,
referring to?
the heavens, like basically the whole medieval Aristotelian.
Yeah, but who got it more right? Nobody. They inference to the best explanation.
I
It was
would
the
claim,
best explanation at the time.
well, okay, fine, but then this is just historicism.
Well,
I mean,
no,
like,
because
and why?
any theory, like Newtonian gravity, has been overturned, but it's also not useless now. Like you should teach people Newtonian mechanics because it's easier to use and it's true in like ordinary cases in fixed reference frames or
Fair
seemingly
enough.
fixed, like inertial reference frames. So like when you develop a theory and science moves forward, the old stuff does not just become invalidated. And it's not like in a theory of metaphysics, we're running into this issue where modern metaphysics is blowing ancient metaphysics out of the water. There isn't a compelling explanation of the problem of universals. There isn't a compelling like metaphysical theory in the modern day that beats Platonism. Like, and yet you need that role in your worldview. You need a metaphysics in order to explain
Well,
what is the ground of these patterns in the world.
I mean,
Explain the similarities that we observe. Like you're not even trying to explain it. You're just saying, oh, it doesn't really need an explanation. I'm claiming that to even utter that, you are relying on language, which implicitly
no,
relies on the regularities in nature, which themselves, again, require that explanation. So it's like you're acting like it's not a problem and just saying that, oh, I don't need to explain that, but you're putting forward no alternative theory. So again, inference to the best explanation. If you don't like the Platonic answer to the problem of universals, then come up with a better answer, or you really don't have anything to contribute.
I mean, didn't Nietzsche essentially overturn Platonism?
No, not with arguments.
Well, that's an alternative theory. I find it more compelling.
What's the
that
theory
basically
of the problem of universals that Nietzsche has?
that basically truth itself is will to power. That there are no, reach between our utterances into the ultimate, and we're just animals in hierarchies.
But why does the hierarchy exist? Is it nominalistic or is it intrinsic in the laws of nature?
I mean, that question would fall prey to the same critique. I mean, you're going to subdue me or not? Who's the leader here? You're upholding a cross. You're representing Christianity. So I find. I mean, I'm not saying that is the only.
But what's the ontology
answer?
of that theory? Like, again, the hierarchy. What kind of subsistence does it have? What kind of necessity does it have? What is the metaphysics there? Why does any of this exist in Nietzsche's
Will to
view?
power? I mean, it's like
Okay,
will
but
to
then
power.
what about the mathematical regularities in nature? I want a philosophical view that actually builds a scientific worldview, like Platonism did.
Okay,
Platonism and
well, then I think
Aristotelianism connected metaphysics down through physics. Nietzsche's
Right.
idea is just that is the verbal poetry. Name one like scientific application of that idea that Nietzsche has. A single scientific application.
Well, anytime anthropological study of humans as animals and power structures. But I think to get to what
so
you would
what
want,
does it allow you to do? What's the explanatory power? You're saying just this vague appeal to anthropology. So like what
I'm
does it
saying, but you can
explain better than
explain
a competing theory? What does it explain
why.
better than Darwinian evolution? Darwin existed before Nietzsche, all right? What does Nietzsche explain better than Darwinian evolution?
Why metaphysics is ridiculous.
That's not explaining anything new. That's like trying to. That's like saying skepticism is an alternative worldview. It's the absence of a worldview.
It is. I mean, well, I guess the positive side of nihilism is that all these great values we have, we created ourselves, and so we can create values that don't have ultimate coherence, and yet they act as if.
You
Again,
don't create values, you tap into them. That's
Well,
like,
right, but this is
the Ubermensch,
what's in
is
dispute.
the
Nietzsche
Ubermensch,
would say
is there
there's
a
nothing to
higher
tap
version
into.
of
As I would
yourself?
say,
Do you believe in that? That there's a higher version of you right now that's here temporally?
no.
You don't think so? So then you're not striving, you're not in becoming, like Nietzsche says, towards the attractor state of the Ubermensch. You're not
The
following his
Ubermensch is
philosophy.
certainly not an ideal to attain.
So you're a Nietzschean who's against the Ubermensch.
You're hypostasizing the Ubermensch notion.
So
If you want to
point,
use
listen, let's back up a little bit. Like, I like Platonism because it built institutions, that built scientific research projects, that built technology, that made the West fucking dominant over everyone. And we need something like that.
Platonism
Like, verbal poetry about a will to power does nothing. Bodybuilders online like it, but it literally cannot build a single thing. Whereas Platonism is useful. Roger Penrose, the famous physicist, finds it useful. Like, mathematicians find it useful to have this ontological ground for what they're doing. Even biologists, Michael Levin, who I referenced earlier in the stream, it makes useful work of the idea of the archetype of the species in novel ways. He considers himself a Neoplatonist, and he's coming up with like all the interesting new stuff in biology that I'm aware of. So there is scientific application. They're like scientific Platonists. There are no scientific Nietzscheans. There are only LARPers online who pretend to be philosophers who have nothing to say. It's vacuous. It has no content, no explanatory power. It doesn't produce science. Good philosophy should produce science. Nietzsche did not produce any science. It's useless.
BAP, the Jewish agent.
I don't even think like
maybe useless, but it
anthropologically
may also be
Nietzsche has
true.
any weight, right? Because we can.
Okay, so the Ubermensch.
Well,
Nietzsche says, and I've read Nietzsche. I actually used to be a Nietzschean first, but it has serious flaws. I've read all of Nietzsche. Nietzsche, you said that I'm hypothesizing the idea of Ubermensch.
Hypostasizing.
But you said that
you're endowing it
will
with an
to
intrinsic
power is a hierarchy. That's what you said. If the will to power exists in a hierarchy,
but an
if Ubermensch is at the
anthropological
top,
application of
then
will
it
to
is
power
in a hierarchy. Like,
just seeing us as animals and not gods with souls is, I mean, this is just empirical. It's just looking at the matter that's the shit of God, according to you, as just the only world there is. That's all it is.
It's just,
I mean,
complete. It's not complete is the problem. Like, what is an animal?
Okay.
What
Neither
is an animal?
yours. Where's
What
your
is it? What?
complete
How do you
world?
explain animal life? How do you explain the laws of physics? How do you explain the natural
Well,
world? Saying
I
it's
see
just
how
the
you
natural world that
explain
you
it. You have
see.
a cross.
It's like just grug
You have
brain
a
philosophy
cross
saying
as
like,
your
I just
bio.
see I'm an animal. Okay, animal, like, have a philosophical theory so that you can explain the world, so you can build technology,
well,
so you
this
can
is
build
the
institutions. Nietzscheanism doesn't do that, and you're not offering an alternative explanation. It's a
well, it's
non-philosophy. It's just
humans
taking up
are a
space,
question.
criticizing, putting forward nothing of substance. There is no theory that I've heard from you whatsoever. So I'm not interested in it.
Well, it seems that Christians' appeal is to like anthropology, right? Like, we're all just walking stomachs, actualizing what we want. But why is it that like a moralism has so much predictability, right? And what we're going to do, right? Like, almost nobody acts on this sort of will to power, how it's described, right? Like, we can reliably expect mothers to act selflessly. We can reliably expect people of the community to act for the community in these moralistic, transcendent, anti-individual ways. Like, so
I mean,
I don't even think your Nietzschean theory has like a anthropological predictability.
Darwinian evolution explains anthropological behavior better than any so-called Nietzschean theory. Nietzsche doesn't have like an articulate hypothesis even of what's driving this, and it's parasitic on the science of his time. He's just assuming the facts of biology as far as he can glean them in his non-scientifically informed perspective. It's like there's no explanatory value here. There's nothing I can do with Nietzscheanism, and like powerful people in the world don't even use it.
explanatory value of note here would be that you represent yourself as a Christian. I take it. You have a cross. And so the apparatus of the Christian God you represent as reasonable. And so Nietzsche disproves it. He mocks it into the truth that it is, in that it's a fallacy and it's ridiculous to maintain. And that's a scientific
And again,
achievement.
that's a non-argument. You're just saying stuff. You're just asserting that Nietzsche disproved this. Like, no. And also, I'm not joining my Christianity with Platonism as a scientific theory here. We can discuss that separately. But I would defend philosophically a Platonic worldview because it's
What's
complete.
the difference?
There are compelling modern Platonists still coming up with interesting ideas. It's still useful. It can still be used like to build a research program, which is what we need. We need to be coordinating research programs. Philosophy has to have the output of changing the world. Like Nietzscheanism is just, it's for like people who don't want scientific truth, who want like aphoristic poetry and not operational, falsifiable hypotheses and testable predictions. It's just not.
So I do hear you. I do hear you, and in light of our first interaction here, I found your talk about forms, compelling, and the scientific use of Platonism is interesting. What rankles me is it is the cross. I mean, I never believed in God before I ever heard of Nietzsche, but this kind of proselytizing smell that comes off of the moral exhortations that you endow onto what you claim as a scientific enterprise. It's like a tranny, like showing off her purple hair.
Yeah, and the passions of just following your passions as the feminine instinct and loving disgusting things, and just because you like them, that means that they're good all of a sudden, just based on your own subjective
It's the
notion.
moralism.
That is the
moralism.
I have a moral theory. Is it wrong to have a moral theory? You have no moral theory. So what's right or wrong?
Then I'm the philosopher.
What
I'm the
separates you from the
scientist.
tranny who doesn't believe in morals?
I'm
Do
not.
you have a moral theory?
I do have a moral theory.
What is it?
This is also an aside, which I won't belabor everyone with, but I have a materialist view of emotions and hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. So it's a Darwinian explanation. It's just whatever won out is what is viewed as moral.
No, it's more like anxiety transfers between people in hierarchies through language, and people determine status through who can transform anxiety with security and vitality and truth. That's basically all she wrote for any form of human discussion.
I mean,
yeah,
I mean, honestly, if you're gonna like, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, why? Oh, geez. All right. Well,
that's
I'm
crazy.
just gonna keep
that's
going.
Actually crazy.
Yeah. So, why do certain moral systems work? Why are they effective? I'm interested in the power.
I think they're all bullshit. Basically, I think moralism
don't, right?
None of them work. What do you look at the fucking world? It's a fucking shit show. Is this working?
I mean, what do you have it to compare it to? You're saying it's all that exists, and what's your moral standard to say it's working or not? You have no moral standard to say that it's working or not working. What does it mean for the world to be working in your worldview? What you're saying is meaningless in your own terms.
Beating up a punching bag, bro.
I think you should, Christian. I think you should like lay down an actual like ontology rooted in phenomenal experience here, right? Because like you seem to just be making I think and I feel statements. Like if you want to attack forms, you could do it from like a Kantian angle, or you could do it from a
I gave you
Humean
my ontology
skepticism.
since I was asked, but I didn't belabor you. But it
The thing with your
Did
ontology
you really?
is that it terminates at a certain point and there's no explanation. You're saying,
I mean, it's
oh,
not even
there are animals, a
ontological.
physical world and animals. But then if you get into a physical theory of the world, you have to get into what are the laws of physics and why are they what they are.
No,
It doesn't just end there. Oh, I'm an animal. I see fruit. I can eat it. I can kill cat
okay,
and skin it
to
and
make
eat it. You're a fucking
to make
Haitian.
it
Like,
even
you don't
more
have a
essential,
theory of the world. That why
and
is
this
the
was
cat
not-
there? Why is the cat there?
I see no cat. So to make it more essential, I essentially think that emotional Marxism is actually what runs everything. That there are ruling cliques of power over emotions and thought. So this is an
And that's
instance
just
of
a
it.
mere
You're
assertion.
the
Like,
leader.
even when
You're
you're
the
saying
leader in the
stuff that
group.
like is sort of, it has some theoretical content, you're just stating it. You're not arguing for any of your positions. I'm kind of tired of
what are you doing?
Unless
I
I'm
mean-
arguing for my positions, I will give in-depth arguments of any assertion that I make. And I have.
Have I not done that?
No, you
yet
have not done
to
that. That's what I'm
anything asked
claiming.
of me?
You're not making good you're not even making
Oh,
arguments. You're
have I
making
not
assertions
spoken?
and claiming
Are you saying
that
I've
things
said
are ridiculous. Like, no, assertions are making statements, but they're not arguments. Assertions are not arguments, and you're not making arguments for why your view is more compelling than the alternative. You're just saying it.
Well, I'm pointing
What's
out
Nietzsche's epistemology?
fallacies
Why do
in
you think
your
you know what
assertions.
You know? Say again.
Your assertions are based on ridiculous fallacies. Pointing that out is itself a useful argument.
So like my assertions about there needing to be universals to explain particulars? That's not a mere assertion. I had multiple lines of argument for why universals have to exist, why the forms have to exist. And you just didn't track them. You didn't remember them. You didn't try to refute them. You just ignored them and then said it's ridiculous.
No, I didn't. I praised you for good arguments in that respect.
Well, let's have some reciprocity and have some good arguments yourself. I just hear assertions. If you don't have arguments, then it's not a philosophical discussion. If you're just trying to make assertions and call names, it's not philosophy, and you don't belong on the show.
I'm not. No, I mean, as I said, I came out. I said I knew I was tumbling into the wrong frame. I recognize you're the leader of this philosophical clique, so I knew we'd end up.
If you're going to be here, you got to make arguments.
I have I not? I mean, I'm at least trying.
Trying? Not really, dude. Can I take on the mantle of the agnostic skeptic and present Eric with some like meaningful questions? Or no?
Sure. Yeah, we can.
If I could get a chance later, I'd like to talk about Schopenhauer a little bit, and I think the Fourier analysis and synthesis is a good answer for universals and particulars, but I'll wait my turn as appropriate.
I agree with that, actually. Yeah, I think that'll be an interesting discussion. I don't think we have time today for it. You're the guy who emailed me, right? Or you messaged me somewhere.
Hold on. I thought I was planning on sending an email, but did I send one by accident? I would have written about how the abstract concepts are pulled out of the empirical experience, but the forms precede the experience, which is why there's error. And you can't necessarily say that abstract logic has a mystical property, which would have been my argument.
Okay. Well, why don't you send me the email that you were planning on sending? Because someone else.
Sure. I wanted to think it over.
I was the one that messaged you on Skype about Carl Jung, Schopenhauer, and Plato.
Well, you guys should talk to each other because it sounds like those should overlap. So who was that? Who actually emailed me?
Me. Well, I mean, you guys are all heavy into Plato, apparently. I just want to ask, what is your take on the Euthyphro dilemma with morality?
That God's like knowledge and God's will are one at the highest level. So it's not like he knows what's right versus commanding what's right. It's not like rightness is at a different ontological level than God. God, like, that's like saying, does God know mathematical truth or can he change it? It's like, no, he is mathematical truth and he is goodness. So it's not like a separable property where it's just arbitrarily because he wills it. Like, no, the nature of the good is its unitive property. Oneness is the ground of goodness. The essence of divinity is simplicity and oneness. So that's
So
how
you said he
you
had no
resolve it.
choice in what would be moral or mathematical. He was forced into the particulars.
Well, I mean, he doesn't have deliberative choice through time in any case because he's eternal, and his will is not like the. I guess you're presuming that to have genuine freedom of the will, we have to make choices through time, like human beings
No, I'm
do.
not presuming anything. I'm just asking, did he have a choice, essentially?
Yeah, and what I'm saying is like to exercise your will is to like exert your proper energies, and that's what God does. So God fully exercises his will without impediment, flawlessly. And so he had the choice in that he exercised himself, but he doesn't have deliberative choice. I would just say that that's superior to the way that humans have deliberative choice. So just to
Okay.
state my position briefly. I'm not giving in-depth
Uh,
arguments. I'm also trying to like
The will is by definition free.
in itself. All right.
Yeah.
Somebody else wanted to take it one last direction uh, before that, before Schopenhauer fan jumped in. Who was just speaking previously?
It was Oscar, wasn't it?
Yeah, Oscar.
well, that was me. But I already asked a question. But if you'll permit me another, I'll get your take on the omnipotence paradox as well.
Okay. Yeah. Same. I mean, it's the same answer. So when
Similar. So, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, it's the same answer. Um, we so the in explanatory terms, I want to build an argument because now I'm all triggered by Nietzscheanism. I'm not going to just give
Thank you.
bold assertions here. So the first principle of things must be unitive because if there are a multiplicity of first principles, something has to explain how they subsist in common, right? And so there is a field in which all these first principles exist in common that's like metaphysically necessary because multiplicity is inconceivable without unity. So the first principle has to be unitive. So God is unitive. And so like the structure of reality must go from a unity to a multiplicity. And we perceive a multiplicity in space time, various regards. And then between ourselves and God, we should expect to find logoi, principles of nature that are less differentiated than the physical world. And then beyond the logoi, there should be more impart, because logoi, physical principles, are kind of bound up with corporeal nature. So beyond them, we should find mathematical entities that comprise the soul in Platonism. So that level needs to be accounted for. And that, like, so mathematical truth, we could say, could God change mathematical truth? Well, God is the reason why mathematical truth is what it is. So oneness is metaphysically necessary. It distributes itself in the necessary forms that there aren't any other ways things could be than having these basic structural features. And there are things like not just arbitrary forms, but being. Things have to have ousia or essence, and that's self-definition. If things can't define themselves, then everything is contingently defined on each other, and nothing has a ground. So to have subsistence, you need self-defining entities. That is the nature of being, essence, self-subsistence, and then sameness, otherness. You need to have beauty or the conspicuity, I guess, of form in a thing. So all of that, the necessary chain leading down to what is possible and what is impossible, is contingent on God's nature. So God determines what is possible. When something is impossible, it's not a genuine reality whatsoever. So when God can't do something self-contradictory, it's not a deficiency of God. It's not as though God could do this thing that is a real possibility, but he's not able to do it. It's that it's not a real possibility, and like what is possible and what is impossible is conditioned on God's nature. Just like what is good and what is bad is conditioned on God's nature, but he doesn't arbitrarily decide. It's not good because God wills it in the ordinary sense, not because he arbitrarily commands it. And like this makes sense more, or the dilemma aspect makes sense more in the Greek context of theology, where the gods make arbitrary claims. So if you have many gods asserting different things, okay, what's actually objectively good? Is it just whatever Zeus wants, or what? So that's the thrust of it there, where it works. For a divinely simple God, a metaphysically necessary creator, then there is the definition of goodness is going to be bound into his nature, and it is in Platonism. The one and the good are one, and similarly with power, that which is able to come into being is substantiated in the first place by the one. All power is grounded on it's having existence, and having existence is grounded in having a unity. To say that something is to say that some one thing is, and the one thing is indispensable for its existence. If you cut me in half, I no longer exist. I exist because I am one organic thing. Take away my unity, you take away my existence. So having power is only possible when you have that unity. It's granted from the one. So that's arguments.
Yeah, that's a very big response. I'd have a bunch of questions picking out different pieces of that. It's kind of hard to keep it all what you said in my brain at once. One thing, would you say that God has no justification for the morality that he willed?
No, I would say it's in what do you call this? It's a reductio ad absurdum for why he willed what he willed. Just like, mathematically, we find that the contrary is not possible. And so the form of reductio ad absurdum is like A or not A. A, like you look at the consequences of A and they run into something that's impossible, therefore not A. So with
Yeah, it's
regard to what is
excluded metal in logic, yeah.
so with regard to what is good, like God, like there isn't another possibility of how things could be. And so it's a reductio ad absurdum argument or justification for why the good is what it is for God.
So you're saying if this is the only way that things could possibly be, this is the only world God could create?
Well, no, I actually do subscribe to a many worlds. But I guess in the widest sense, the world, as in reality as a whole, is the only way it could possibly be.
Yeah, I'd have to ask you a bunch of questions of your stances to give you more pointed questions.
Sure,
So I'm guessing you're not a determinist
in
the
what sense?
in the local sense of this particular universe, but like
Yeah, not
overall, you're
in a global sense. I'm a determinist. I'm a to summarize it imperfectly, I'm a block time multiverse determinist. But then relative to us, our reference frame indeterminism is real.
I have so many questions. Are you a physicalist or a dualist?
I'm a idealistic leaning monist.
Okay. Not exactly sure of the descriptor there, but going back to the original questions about the morality, I mean,
Is compassion a good basis for morality?
The thing is, this isn't all possible. He's not creating all possible, or he's not creating all worlds. You're saying he's creating all possible worlds. So
And he determines the conditions of possibility. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm trying to. I had so many questions. If anyone else wants to talk, go ahead. I'm just thinking in my head.
I'm actually interested in your system's relationship to Schopenhauer and Kant's, right? Because, so in the first book of World as One Representation, Schopenhauer remarks that the lesson from Kant is that the PSR is not applicable outside of space-time, right? So, I mean, how do you take that and then are you able to ruminate on universal forms and universal good explicitly above space-time, right? Or is Schopenhauer just wrong there, and that's the deviation?
May I answer the question? Because I think this is in the book 3 about aesthetics. The purely objective observation has a sort of artistic empirical consciousness where the breadth of the species is viewed greater than the specimen, or the genius sees the species out of the specimen, this sort of access to the forms. And this is possible through a sort of meditative or an artistic state, the type of wider contextual intelligence that is sort of harder to obtain, but does actually exist. And this is actually metaphysically possible because we are the world, because we have a shared unity. It's possible for in our observations to empathize with and then express variant forms, or to imagine things out of it. Because we represent the world, we can render coherent representations. Is that fair?
I'm not sure if that really answers the question.
Oh, sorry.
Well, no. I mean, I could be the one mistaking here, right? Like, I'm not the biggest Schopenhauer guy ever. So, but if the PSR is inherently connected to space-time, I don't see how we can employ it to have like true justified knowledge about forms, right? Forms qua themselves.
The forms are the form. Oh, sorry. Under Schopenhauer's system, the forms are an intermediate grade between the noumenal unified will to the particular object. So all species, all specimens fall under a species. If you want to think about it in the sort of Fourier quantum waves world, you could say that the sort of the same magnitude of the impulse or the amplitude is the single will. It's the same thing, but then the shape of the wave and its position in the space-time is how it will express itself statistically.
So so that would put forms clearly in the world of representation, then, right?
Well, it's an intermediate grade, Schopenhauer says. So because it's not the sort of artistic consciousness isn't purely logical anymore, because logic and abstract concepts are subordinated in the system. In fact, he has that chart of the concept spheres where,
Oh, just to elaborate the same thing you were saying, I think, like the issue is space-time. He's taking, obviously, in a Kantian sense, and thinks we can't think beyond it. But in modern physics, we do have entities that are supposed to exist that go beyond space-time, like the quantum wave function. It doesn't exist in one place in space or time. It's a mathematical, so it fits in with Platonism. There are mathematical entities at the level of, well, soul in Platonism that are beyond physical space-time, and yet they are conceivable because, like, the nature of reason actually does go beyond space-time. Space-time isn't as absolute a limit on thought as Schopenhauer believed. So I think that's the main mistake. He also rejected the intellectual
and what's the
intuition.
principle?
Schopenhauer rejected intellectual intuition, and I think he was wrong to do that. He's an empiricist, and I think that's basically just a factor of his influences, which include Locke and Hume and others.
What principle of individuation would you use for non-spatio-temporal knowledge? Like, what sort of condition or what system of classification gives us a principium individuationis to get distinct knowledge that is outside of space-time?
We don't find a line without breadth, without width, but we come to definition, or we don't find a circle with its circumference perfectly equidistant from the center, but we come to the definition. So if we gather that from sense perception. The sense perceptions are admittedly less precise or less exact. And so for us to come to a more exact definition, say of like a surface without depth, we have to have some criterion to make something that's less perfect more perfect.
Well, maybe I should ask is there a form of math we can use for these entities that is irrespective of space and time and is respective of this different type of knowledge that's not spatiotemporal?
I mean,
all
space-time is 4D limited. You could just take any 5D object, can't be represented. You can get the shadow of it represented though in
Well,
4D.
sure, but when I think of calculating five-dimensional objects, I think of principle of sufficient reason again.
Yeah, but you're not talking about dimensions in the sense of they're at right angles, like
Well, they
dimensions
could
of
be
space.
they could be
Of
quaternion algebra or non-Euclidean for all I care, but there's a coherent sort of absolute reference rule, right? So if there's different knowledge we can access with different frames of reference, then that's great, because then you can sort of judge the same object from different perspectives to try and classify it objectively. But
well,
I don't necessarily
how do
know.
we come to definition of a line being without any width? Like, what's our reference? We have to have a reference, something that's, or even that there's such a thing as a line, or the definition of a line.
Is that what you're asking? That's the Kantian
Yeah.
pure concepts of the understanding. That's him sort of pulling it out of like, this is the most basic form of the manifold of intuition is the word he uses. So there's
But
this
are
idea.
those things implanted like Kant's very difficult? Are the
I would say,
intuitions things that are like a priori?
well, they're prior to the experience because they're what make the experience possible. He's asking, like, how is it possible to make necessary universal judgments without having your scientific observation? Because you had the human induction problem and the metaphysics questions of, are we stuck only judging things by these inductive habits where we don't know for sure? Well, because every experience conforms to the rules of the pure concepts of understanding, then if you map something like mathematics, which strictly obeys these pure concepts in clear terms, then we always then it always works. So because definitionally you have, your 1 + 1, your 5 + 5, you can conform to perfect rules. And then it's simply a question of if the empirical object applies to the pure concept. And then it works a priori. And
But if we're
sorry.
counting units, say like his example of that 5 + 7 or something, that a unit is something that can't be divided. Or would any of these things, or say a point, like we come to understand what is meant by a point as something without length, breadth, or depth. Is there, if we have that, I guess a priori as an intuition, the Kantian sense, is there such thing as a point?
Not empirically. That's why he said it's the condition of experience, and why you can't find evidence to justify a universal, necessary, logical judgment. You have to, it just works because you sort of reference it in the intuition, and that's why you're able to count, and you can just keep counting.
He's saying math is just derived deductively from empirical observations, right?
Well, no. The idea is all experience. You can prior to experience know something because you have the mathematical concept, and then if the empirical thing has the same conditions as that pure intuition, then it will conform to it because the intuitions are what make the understanding, are what render the perception.
Wait, where did you get the mathematical concepts without empirical observation?
The pure concepts of the understanding are what make experience possible in Kant's system.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, he's kind of making a maneuver of we couldn't have experience unless there were these intuitions
Well, you can say
And
it's causality, like you can say all of them are causality or the principle of sufficient reason. And then this actually, if you must start with somebody from a materialistic perspective, you can actually try to reverse engineer some of this stuff with what Schopenhauer says about the sort of the brain stuff, actually, because that conforms to rules, and then you can have emergent processes where something comes out of that. And he was essentially proven right because he got Darwin before Darwin.
well, if we can't have the experiences without the intuitions, and we can't have the intuitions unless there's such things as, say, a point that's not has no magnitude or a
Well,
line.
yeah, the intuitions are the first thing. That's why they're prior to experience. They're what make experience possible. And that's what the transcendental philosophy isn't transcendent philosophy. It's actually sort of a backwards derivation of like, if we're seeing things, sight has to be possible. Right? It's
Well,
how we
continuity, because space, as one of his in these intuitional things, is space is continuous. So if we have the intuition of space, we have to have some sense of continuity.
yeah,
And
this is on the table. This is on the table of categories.
okay, well, if
Yeah. So let's go back to the question: can we differentiate these forms prior to space and time? And like,
Yeah,
yeah, what about
are there non-spatial ways? Yeah.
yeah? Well, sameness and difference don't seem to be contingent on space or time. They seem to structure the possibility of space and time. Also, limit and the unlimited seem to be prior to space and time. Like they're presumed in the notion of space and time.
Yeah, and existence is presumed by experience too.
Yeah. So there are things prior to space time that we can distinguish.
yeah, and if there weren't such things, then we wouldn't be able to have the intuitions of sameness and difference unless there was such a thing as sameness. And if
I
we
still
end
have
up
a
pointing
problem with the mental intuition of mathematical concepts. You're saying like a blind person would understand what it means to see or like have a notion of shape or form, or like, you know, if someone didn't have their faculties of whatever sense perception they had, they would have it innately in their mind what it would be.
Are you talking the occipital lobe or the sense organ? Because I would argue biologically it actually does exist in like the occipital or the temporal lobe, or at least the emergent process where that's possible overlaps with there. If somebody wants to be really idealistic about it, it's
Well,
not in the sense organ itself.
this is all really good. I'm enjoying this show quite a bit. We're going to keep doing it. We'll do it more often. Thanks everyone who participated today. I do have to just wrap it up. Like I didn't realize what time it was. After I wrap it up right now. But yeah, appreciate it. If anyone wants to ask questions, remember we're not reading the live chat anymore. It's crowded enough here in the call. But if you want to contribute a question or comment, use entropy in the future. We'll be doing this. Schedule to be determined, but probably mid-afternoon like this, maybe occasionally later. You'll just have to kind of keep an eye out. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and have a good rest of your day.
Night, guys.